Insulin sensitivity. This is something that you keep bringing up. Talk about what that is and why it matters.
So insulin is this wonderful hormone that has largely gotten a really bad rap because of this metabolic health base and, seeing all these escalating rates of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes and PCOS and all these other metabolic diseases. But insulin sensitivity really comes down to when you eat a meal, depending on what macronutrients you've consumed, protein, fat, or carbohydrates, understanding that fat has the most negligible impact on blood sugar and subsequently insulin, then protein, then carbohydrates. So if you eat a bowl of ice cream, that's not a good. So you sit down and eat a bowl of chips, you're going to get a much more exaggerated blood sugar response and insulin response than if you eat, you eat a stick of butter. I don't know anyone that would do that, but let's just use that as an example. And then understanding that if we are in a state where we're eating like a standard American diet, where we're eating every 2 to 3 hours, we're having snacks, we're having mini meals, we're eating 6 to 10 times a day, that's 6 to 10 times a day that your blood sugar goes up in response to the meal or the snack. Your insulin levels go up in response to what you've eaten, and you're not really giving your body time to bring that blood sugar and insulin back down. And when your insulin levels remain high, you are not able to tap into fat stores for energy. And over time, if insulin is, you get this buffering effect. Insulin's a hormone and it's designed to shuttle blood sugar into cells. But if over time it's overwhelmed, overworked, your cells will actually get resistant to the lock and key mechanism that goes on with this hormone. So instead of shuttling instead of insulin doing its job to take blood sugar and put it in the cell, it just continues to circulate. So then you're dealing with these correspondingly, usually symptoms. These are individuals that may have things like a storage problem with blood sugar in their liver called NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. They can have skin tags. They may be urinating frequently. They may have changes in their vision. They may have kidney issues. They will become weight loss resistant over time. They may develop high blood pressure. They may have high triglycerides and low HDL. There's a lot of different metrics that we can kind of look at to turn the lever to kind of look at, is there some degree of insulin resistance? But insulin resistance all comes down to this communication problem of getting your blood sugar, taking that glucose molecule and moving it into the cells intracellularly. And if you're eating if you're eating frequently, then you're making it harder for your body to be able to properly regulate these hormones. Now, if you're eating 2 times a day, 3 times a day, not snacking in between, your body can work much more effectively. It goes, you eat a meal, you have this bolus of protein and carbohydrates, blood sugar goes up to accommodate, insulin goes up, comes back down. You have a lowered insulin state throughout the day in between meals. You very likely are not falling asleep. You're very likely not having energy crashes. You have sustained energy. You've got very clear, cohesive thoughts. You're not weight loss resistant, generally speaking. And so it's really helpful to understand that there are many lifestyle mediated things that we do that impact how sensitive our insulin is in terms of communication with our cells. Things like meal frequency, stress, poor quality sleep, exposure to toxins, over exercising, or, not properly fueling your body, doing, chronic cardio, which I'm sure I'll probably get hate mail over. But it's important for people to understand there's a lot that we have under our control, but it really starts with understanding that insulin is our friend. It is not a bad hormone. Same thing with blood sugar. Glucose is not an enemy either, but it's our modern day lifestyles and the ways that we eat that are negatively impacting these hormone pathways and our ability for our bodies to be able to effectively lower our blood sugar, move the blood sugar into the cells, properly regulate these key hormones. I mean, there's a lot more that goes on, but I would say that's kind of like the basic thing. So when I talk about metabolic flexibility, it's our body's ability to effectively free up both stored sugar and stored fats as a fuel source. And that's what happens when our insulin levels are low. As we are becoming more metabolically flexible, our body can decide, am I being chased by a rabid animal and I need to flee? I need quick energy. I'll use those carbohydrates. Nope, I need to run a marathon. I'm going to actually, or I need to, be very focused on intense intellectual work. I'm taking an exam. Okay, then, what's going to happen is your body's going to go in and free up these fatty acids. or even another fuel substrate or ketones, which actually diffuse across the blood-brain barrier. And our brains really like fat. So a lot of what goes on in terms of, doing this switch of talking about metabolic flexibility is understanding that we have a lot under our control, but so much about insulin sensitivity is a byproduct of our lifestyle. So there's a lot that we can do. I want to make sure I make that message very clear. There's a lot we can do to improve this. It's not once you are no longer insulin sensitive, that's a, do or die. It's really, that is reversible. Most metabolic diseases, most chronic diseases are completely reversible, but you have to do the work.
And this ties back to what we talked about before, where insulin is more sensitive at night versus earlier in the day, as a general statement overlying what you just said.
Yeah, so we're much more insulin sensitive earlier in the day. That's much more aligned with this kind of chronobiologic rhythm in our bodies. So if you're going to have those carbohydrates, I always say, have them in the morning or early afternoon. Don't sit down and have, my teenagers do this, but like adults shouldn't do this, like this massive bowl of pasta with a teeny tiny piece of like protein. Don't have that right before bed, because that's going to make it harder for your body to actually process this massive bolus of processed carbohydrates. Very different than having a sweet potato or, an orange or, a bowl of berries. Very, very different.
I may have said that backwards. You're more insulin sensitive in the morning, less at night.
Yes, I knew what you meant.
Let's talk about somebody who, in general, has lost that sensitivity. This ties back to the fasting and some of the other things we've been talking about. But let's give them a handful of things they can do to start off in a really general sense to work their way back in the beginning.
Yeah, I think this is important for people to know that there's definitely a path back. So number one, prioritize protein. It will keep you satiated. Number two, if you know that if you've lost a degree of insulin sensitivity, be mindful of your carbohydrate intake. And by that, I mean, maybe you need to measure your carbohydrate. Maybe you have a quarter cup of berries. I know this will make people mad. Maybe you have half a cup of sweet potato. I mean, you really do have to be mindful. I would say intermittent fast, starting with ripping off the Band-Aid and stop snacking. Don't eat after dinner. Maybe you start with 12 or 13 hours of fasting. We know even that confers benefits. I always say 12 hours should be the norm for everyone, irrespective of what life stage they're in. So some degree of intermittent fasting, making sure you're sleeping. Like, we know if you get less than 6 hours a night of sleep, you reduce your ability to control your blood sugar and mitigate your blood sugar by up to 60%. It also impacts your leptin and ghrelin, appetite and satiety hormones, which is really important. I would say hydrate, move your body. Like, even 10 to 15 minutes of walking after a meal will help mitigate your blood sugar response. Like, that should be a bare minimum. I used to make fun of these couples in my neighborhood that would walk in the evening. Now we become those couples, but it's really because we know there's so many benefits. I mean, literally all you need are shoes to be able to walk after a meal. Like, get outside, walk for 10 or 15 minutes. I don't care how cold it is. Put a hat on and gloves and, a jacket. Or if you want to, really evoke some hormesis, maybe you can be like my husband. He wears like sweatshirts. I'm like, have you turned into a teenager? Like, my teenagers are impervious to coats, and so is my husband as of late. So walking after a meal. I think the other thing is to get hormone levels checked. Like, I think this is very important. Not just sex hormones, but get a fasting insulin checked. Everyone listening should have a fasting insulin drawn a couple times a year. Gives you a real sense of where you need to be. And we know a fasting insulin will dysregulate way before your blood sugar, way before that A1C that everyone likes to perseverate over. Look at inflammatory markers. A fasting insulin is cheap. If you have someone that's not willing to draw it, it's anywhere from $15 to $20 based on what I've seen online. It's not a functional medicine test. It's not an expensive test, but I think it can be very helpful. And I always say knowledge is power. And then the last thing is understanding that stress also impacts blood sugar, also impacts cortisol, also impacts insulin, and trying to manage your stress. I'm not saying like a little bit of stress is good. Like, stress is normal, right? But if you have chronic, unrelenting, uncontrollable stress, and it starts from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment you go to bed, you got to change something. I don't care if it's you take 5 minutes at the end of your day to read a book locked in your bathroom because you got little kids. I remember those days. Maybe it's you hire a sitter so that you have an hour to yourself once or twice a week. if you're a single parent or you don't have a lot of family support. But finding time to be able to prioritize doing something that brings you joy is going to be very, very important. And so I think those are the things I would probably start with, because I know we started the conversation saying it's overwhelming when you think about all the things, but it really does start with food. What we eat and when we eat really matters. And those two metrics alone can have a profoundly impactful impact on blood sugar variability as well as insulin sensitivity.
I want to highlight something you brought up there that's really important. The fact that getting an insulin test done fasted, the importance of that, because what can happen in the body if you're only measuring blood glucose and then using that as your measurement of your metabolic health, over time, as you're becoming more insulin resistant, the body's just going to make more insulin to keep that blood glucose at bay. And if all you're measuring is the glucose, you're going to think you're fine. But in the background, for years and years, you can be insulin resistant, and all kinds of health complications can be happening in the background.
Yeah, I think, when I finished my nurse practitioner program back in the 2001 timeframe, we used to say that patients with a blood sugar under 140 were good. Now it's under 100. So at least we're heading in the right direction. But that gray area of how many women I see that are really scooching towards being insulin resistant, it's not yet showing up on their A1C, which is a 90-day snapshot of blood sugar control. Their blood sugar is a little higher than I want it to be. And even checking at home, it's not where it should be. And then we draw fasting insulin and the light bulb goes off. It's like, oh, your fasting insulin's 20. Well, now I know why you're not losing weight. Talk about fasting insulin's high. Guess what? You're not going to be able to tap into fat stores. So helping people understand that fasting insulin can be a hugely insightful lab value to be looking at that is inexpensive, very valuable. I track my own. Like, I know what my fasting insulins have been over the last 4 or 5 years, because it kind of gives me a sense of, what direction my thyroid is going into. But I think it's helpful for people to know you can ask for these tests. This is a test that's covered by insurance. This may be helpful for helping you uncover what's really going on below the surface. And so I think that should be standard of care. Unfortunately, it's not. There's still a lot of providers that just do A1Cs. And I'm like, well, that's great. That doesn't tell me a lot. Oh, that looked good. Okay.
Before we part ways, we'll end on this. And this ties back to something you talked about before, where putting on muscle is actually going to help us regulate glucose as well. So just coming full circle and tying that into this part of the conversation of ways to manage blood glucose.
So think about your muscles as like a glucose reservoir. Every time you're building muscle, you are building opportunities for your body to be able to dispose of glucose. And so for all those people out there who are fearful, they don't want to look too muscular. Well, as an example, women just don't have enough circulating testosterone to ever look like a man. Like that's physiologically impossible unless you're taking exogenous steroids. And that's a whole separate conversation. But it's helpful for people to understand that the more muscle mass you have, the more muscle we have on our body, skeletal muscle, the more likely you are to be insulin sensitive. And that is incredibly impactful and important as we are getting older. If you take nothing else away from our conversation, muscle really is critically important for metabolic health. Think of it as a sponge for blood sugar. Think of it as sponge for your glucose. And that the more muscle we have, the less we have to worry about your insulin levels not being optimized. So something to really think about. And the other thing to kind of tie into that is, as we are getting older and as we're having all these sex hormone fluctuations that do occur with normal functions of aging, don't be fearful if you've done all the other work to consider hormone replacement therapy. Have a conversation with your GYN or your internist. Understand that the Women's Health Initiative that came out around 2002, which I was largely insulated with being in cardiology, but now understand a whole lot better. We have a whole generation of clinicians that are fearful to talk about prescribing hormones, when for many individuals, whether it's male or female, one of the things that they can benefit from in terms of insulin sensitivity, if they've done all the other work, like all of it, and they still need a little bit support, that having a bit of estradiol and progesterone and possibly testosterone on board can make a big difference. Big difference in all these lifestyle pieces that we've talked about today.
And I believe, Cynthia, last time we talked, you mentioned you were using a cream, a progesterone cream. Is that still part of your healthy routine?
Well, I use oral progesterone 6 nights a week, and I was taking a break from the HRT I was on because I had been like I was on too much, and so it was like kind of having this wash down. So now I have an estrogen patch and I have a cream testosterone, and so I'm on all three. About 75% of women don't make enough testosterone in menopause to be able to kind of get by without it. 25% of women do. And so I always say testosterone, you might be one of those people, those magical unicorns that don't need that. But that for me has been very helpful for continuing to build muscle. And I know we could have a whole tangential conversation, but very value individual, work with a practitioner that knows what they're doing so that you can ensure you're getting the support that you deserve to have.
If you're enjoying the episode, take a second and let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much. And now back to the episode. I really want to go deep into intermittent fasting and specifically from a women's perspective. I've covered it so many times on the show, this practice, which is, very simple when we get to the root of it. But you're an expert when it comes to how to do this properly as a woman. So excited to go deep and go granular with you on that.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to actually, I watch your podcast, so it's really nice to connect. It's always nice as a podcaster to connect with other kind of like-minded podcast owners as well.
We have a lot to get into. We're going to have a lot of fun. And I want to start off by talking about a myth that you actually dispel in your book. And this is a very broad, overarching myth that I think is a good jumping off place, talking about how intermittent fasting is unsafe for women. Let's debunk that.
Yeah, it's a source of endless frustration for me because I have to believe that the healthcare professionals or the fit pros that are propagating this myth have good intention. But I remind people way before we had grocery stores and refrigeration and pasteurization, the processed food industry, we were able to, both genders were able to mitigate food scarcity. And so when someone says that fasting is dangerous for women, I think it really sends a very strong message, a very negative message that loses out on the fact that from an ancestral health perspective, we have been fasting as a species for thousands of years. It's, interwoven into most, if not all of the major religions. And I like to remind people that before we had the conveniences that we do today, we really did go through periods of time when we were not able to have access to food, or we were eating twigs and berries and maybe occasionally able to have a kill and maybe get some meat. So when someone suggests that it's not a viable option, or it's not the antithesis of our kind of standard American diet, is really doing us a tremendous disservice, because the concept of eating frequently, too frequently, in fact, and eating hyperpalatable processed foods is doing far more detriment than the concept of eating less often within a prescribed feeding window or time frame.
Well, let's continue on that trend you started to open up there and talk about what intermittent fasting is. If somebody is totally new to this practice, what does it mean?
It really means eating less often. And I always suggest that sometimes we make it far more complicated than it needs to be. And for a lot of people, the stepping off point is going from dinner the night before until breakfast the following day. And that means not eating snacks or food after dinner time, and then sleeping in a fasted state and waking up and maybe not eating within the first hour of waking. And you've already done 13 or 14 hours fasted. And I think the new continuum needs to be, or the new recommendation needs to be, at a minimum, all adults should eat, should give themselves 12 hours of digestive rest, meaning that there's at least 12 hours a day. Maybe it's from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. or 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., but to allow our bodies to really get optimized, because the meal frequency piece, what we've been taught about, breakfast is the most important meal of the day, that we need to stoke our metabolism, in air quotes, that we need to have snacks and mini meals throughout the day, is really at the root for a great deal of the health and metabolic health issues that we're seeing right now.
For somebody brand new to this, the thought of skipping breakfast can be quite terrifying. Talk about how over time the body evolves and how to go about making the process more gentle and set the person up for success.
Absolutely. And I'm all about being very transparent that a lot of this is very bio-individual. So if someone is frightened or fearful, I don't want them to be. It really starts with the basics. So when we're first working together, the first thing I recommend is to stop snacking, because the snacking piece will force you to refortify what you are eating at your meals. So really focused on protein, non-starchy vegetables, healthy fats, the right types of fats, the right types of carbohydrates to keep you satiated between breakfast and lunch and dinner and breakfast. And that is the antithesis of the kind of Americanized standard American diet, where we're taught that, we want to eat every 2 to 3 hours. We want to eat with greater meal frequency, because ultimately what we want to train our body to do is to effectively utilize both fats, ketones, and carbohydrates or glucose as fuel sources. So you want to be able to use both. Most people are stuck in this carbohydrate burning mode, which is highly inefficient. And you can generally tell the people that are, stuck in this carbohydrate driven, glucose driven paradigm, because they struggle to lose weight. They get hangry if they're not able to get food when they get hungry. They have energy slumps. They aren't able to get through their day. They may, in fact, get very sleepy after meals. That is not normal, but that is the norm for most Americans. And what I want people to work towards is that as we are eating less frequently, and ultimately as we burn through our sugar and get into the fat stores for energy, you're going to have improved mental clarity. You're going to have lowered insulin levels. You're going to become much more metabolically efficient. And metabolic efficiency or metabolic flexibility is what all of us should aspire to be. When I worked in cardiology as a nurse practitioner, and I would see certain combinations of labs that were abnormal, like high triglycerides, low HDL, which is the heart healthy cholesterol, high blood pressure. We would see, abnormal lipid levels and, abnormal fasting glucose and certainly fasting insulin, a large waist circumference. Those are signs that your body is becoming less metabolically efficient. But as I stated earlier, the other signs that you can look for to talk about metabolic flexibility is, do you fall asleep after eating a meal? I'm not just talking about Thanksgiving. I'm saying in general, do you get tired? Do you not have enough energy an hour or two after eating? Or do you get hungry in between meals? Because that can also be a sign that you're either not as metabolically flexible as you need to be, or you're just putting your meals together in a really non-advantageous way. So from my perspective, a lot of the training that I do when someone is quote unquote dipping their toe in the pond of fasting is removing the snacking, moving on to teaching people not to eat after dinner, then kind of moving on to restructuring your meals. And this is critically important. Everything starts with what we put in our mouths. So, you're not going to maximize your gains with fasting if you're still eating McDonald's 3 times a day. So I always encourage people to be moving towards a more nutrient dense, less processed diet. And that's a lot of the training that I do, that, when you start eating more nutrient dense foods, you're going to be full. You're going to hit those satiety cues. You're not going to be looking for ice cream and cookies and more servings of processed carbs. You're going to feel satiated, push the plate away, and feel comfortable and confident that your next meal will be, several hours later, 4 to 5 hours later, or perhaps the following day. And so through several steps, we kind of move slowly through this process. I don't recommend that anyone go from being a couch potato, eating a standard American diet, and then immediately shift into trying to fast for 16 hours, because you will ultimately, unless you are a unicorn, you will ultimately kind of set yourself up for feeling pretty darn uncomfortable through that process. So we kind of do it slowly so that women will gain the confidence that they can ultimately continue to fast along this continuum and do it successfully.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that people should be afraid of skipping breakfast initially if they've been eating, very standard type foods and eating in a standard type way with snacking. You have a very slow approach to help people get to the point where they can skip breakfast and not sweat about it.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things that are important for people to understand. Fasting is not starving. So that's an important distinction, because people assume like, oh my gosh, if I'm not eating, I'm starving. No, they're very different. But understanding what you can consume in a fasted state, and that's plain coffee, bitter tea, so black tea, green tea. Bitter is better. And there's actually components, there are polyphenols, which are plant-based compounds, which are in both plain coffee, bitter teas that can upregulate fat oxidation, which means we can burn more fat. We definitely want to keep ourselves well hydrated. I don't believe in dry fasting. That's not something that I teach. And I'm a huge proponent of electrolytes. And electrolytes are things that you're probably familiar with, like high quality salt, magnesium, potassium chloride, etc. And in my 16 years working in cardiology, I'm ridiculously savvy with electrolytes. So first, understanding what you can consume in a fasted state, I think, is very important. Secondly, it's understanding that when you break your fast, the way that you want to structure your meals, and it may be that you go from dinner to breakfast at 8 a.m. So maybe you've gone 14 hours and you feel pretty good. That when you break your fast, you want to break your fast with some protein. Protein is the most satiating macronutrient. The other two macronutrients are fats and carbohydrates. I'm not anti-carb. I want to be very clear about that. But I think it's important to eat high quality carbohydrates. I lean into a lot of vegetables. Non-starchy vegetables is one example. I like healthy fats. So if you're sitting down to have a piece of salmon or a ribeye, you have plenty of healthy fats already incorporated in that protein. You don't need to then add a cup of nuts and 5 pats of butter on your vegetables. So I think that's an important distinction. If you're having a lean protein, like a piece of chicken breast or turkey, or maybe you're having a piece of cod, you can absolutely add some healthy fats into your diet. So it's always protein and fat when you eat, or protein and carbohydrates. You never, ever, ever have carbs by themselves. You get the most impact on your blood sugar and insulin levels when you have carbs by themselves. And so protein and fats will help buffer some of that impact. So I think it's critically important just to understand that restructuring your meals is going to be very, very important to help with satiety. And that's something that we've been conditioned as a society to eat heart healthy grains and lots of carbs. And I'll be the first person to say that it's the processed carbs more often than not. And the inflammatory seed oils is another example that have really gotten us into trouble. And so if you kind of use that formulation of going from dinner to breakfast without eating, breaking your fast, which you can break your fast at any point, but breaking your fast in the morning with protein and fat or protein and carbs. And we don't have to make it complicated. It could be bacon and eggs. It could be an avocado with some leftovers from the night before. You really don't have to make it complicated. But because we've been conditioned to have essentially dessert for breakfast, those muffins, the cereals, the Pop-Tarts, sugar sweetened yogurts, things like that, that becomes problematic because those habits can be challenging to break. But I can assure you that once you get to a point when your body's much more metabolically efficient, eating in this manner is going to guarantee you that you're going to get some really fantastic results.
In your book, you talk about for you, and again, we're all different. We're going to have, different stages in life when we, fasting might look different for us. And I don't want everybody just to run out and do what you're doing. But in your book, you talk about waiting till about noon to eat typically. And you gave examples there of different foods and talking about some of the beverages we can have when we're in that fasted state. So I think at this point, it'd be helpful, Cynthia, if you could share with us what a typical morning looks like for you. Which of these beverages are you consuming? And then go through what you would eat in a day. Obviously it's going to be different day to day, but what could that look like?
It's a great question. It's one I'm asked frequently. So when I get up in the morning, I have about 12 ounces of filtered water, and I have the first set of electrolytes that I'll add into my water. And that's just a given. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I do have bitter tea. This morning I had black tea. Tomorrow I may have green tea. If you don't love the taste of bitter teas, I encourage you to drink it with a straw. That's how I learned how to drink them and enjoy them, because there's so many benefits that you get from these beverages that it's worth it to find a way around it. If you don't like bitter coffee, like plain coffee, if you've been putting cream and sugar, the two things that you can do that will not break a fast but can, impact the flavor profile of coffee. Number one is sea salt. You can add sea salt or you can add cinnamon, and cinnamon will actually increase insulin sensitivity. So that's another benefit. I haven't actually added them to the bitter teas, but I'm sure you could do the same as well. I just prefer to have them straight up. So for me, I've been actually, during the past 2 years, I've been breaking my fast a little earlier, depending on how physically active I am. So yesterday was a leg day. I broke my fast at 10 a.m. I closed my window at 6. So at 10 a.m. yesterday, I actually had a protein shake, which I don't normally do, but it was one of those very busy media days. And so I had a protein shake with about 40 grams of protein. And I had that with probably I would say probably half a cup of blueberries because it was a leg day. I can have a little bit more discretionary carbs. And then my next meal, I sat down and actually had chicken breast. I had broccoli. I had a little, even though I tend to be dairy intolerant, I do tolerate grass-fed butter. And so that was, the second meal. So I'm always aiming for anywhere from 40 to 50 grams of protein with each meal, which means my protein portions are quite large. And then later in the afternoon, I actually had some bison ragu, which was delicious. I had that over some cauliflower rice. And then I closed my window. And sometimes in my home, because I have teenagers and they're not back from sports until in the evening time, oftentimes I'm sitting with them and I've already closed my window, but they understand that I eat within a compressed feeding window, and that works for me. And there's a lot of research to demonstrate that aligning your feeding windows with chronobiology. So when it's light outside, we eat. When it's dark outside, we don't. Not eating, within 3 to 4 hours of bedtime. I trend all my data on my Oura Ring. I'm not affiliated with Oura. I just love tracking data. A little bit of a nerd. And so I can look at like when I have meals and later in the evening and how it disrupts my sleep. And that's what works for me. So every person that's listening may need to augment based on, their needs, the personally, professionally, and otherwise. They may need to adjust their feeding and fasting windows a little bit differently. Certainly, if I was still in the hospital seeing patients and in clinic, I wouldn't have the degree of flexibility that I have. And I acknowledge that. But I do have plenty of clinicians and people that have very demanding jobs that do intermittent fast around their work schedule. They just have to be a little more regimented because they may not get as many opportunities to eat. But on a given day, I aim for 100 grams of protein easily. I don't count my carbs, but I do carb cycle. So I always have 1 or 2 days out of the week where I tend to be higher carbohydrate. And by high, it's not nearly what the average American is doing. The average American is anywhere from 200 to 300 grams of carbs a day. I'm probably on a higher day, probably 75 or 100. I'm not ketogenic, but I generally my happy place is about 50 total carbs a day. And that's, I've gotten to a point, I've been doing this for so long that I can eyeball my portions. But when I was doing this, new several years ago, it was a little bit more measuring and kind of tinkering to find where the sweet spot was for me.
Let's come back to the bitter drinks in the morning, the tea, the coffee. What if somebody, you mentioned their cinnamon and sea salt, not things I've tried to implement with my coffee, but interesting. What about somebody who's made the switch already from, say, like a standard white sugar to like monk fruit, xylitol, stevia? I believe xylitol might spike the glycemic index, but I don't believe stevia or monk fruit does. Just curious on your thoughts if somebody goes that route to sweeten those beverages in the morning. Does that break the fast?
Well, I don't think it's a clean fast. And so I like people to, and there are people who want to argue to the death on this. Yes, maybe in a lab animal, it did not evoke an insulin response, but there's something called the cephalophase insulin response. And you put something sweet on your tongue, your body is getting ready for food. And whether or not it is, whether or not you are doing a clean fast or a dirty fast, and I can differentiate between what they are, I like people to learn best practices. So if you are going from table sugar to stevia in an effort to reacclimate your palate with the intention of going to black coffee, that's fine. But if you're using that as like you're going to put monk fruit or stevia or thyrotol or any of the other cleaner sugars that are out there, the intent should always be like you're moving towards a clean fast. That's always, I like people to have best practices. I cannot tell you how many people dirty fast and then they don't get the results they're looking for. And when I start kind of examining what they're doing, I remind them that it doesn't mean it's calorie-less. There's still some properties that you're adding to these drinks. And certainly for women, unfortunately, as we get older, you have to be more conscientious about discretionary food. And so I think it's fine if you understand why you're doing it. Just like for the same reason, if someone's on a standard American diet and is couch potato and they have to use a fatty coffee to get from dinner to breakfast without feeling awful as their body's kind of detoxing and processing, getting rid of all this highly inflammatory food that they've been eating, I think it's always with the intention. And it's something that certainly Dave Asprey has taught me, that, meeting people where they are and acknowledging that not everyone's ready to go directly to a clean fast. They may have to have, a little, put the training wheels on the bike, and they're doing this as an intention to kind of move to clean fasting. And I think that's an important differentiator. What are your goals? What are you working towards? Because if you have a problem with sugar, and a lot of people do, using stevia, using erythritol, using monk fruit as an alternative is fine, but you still may be masking the fact that you actually have a problem with sugar. And the example is those bitter teas are bitter. They are not meant to be sweet. And so I remind myself when I'm drinking a bitter tea that there's a purpose there. Like bitter teas, bitter foods, bitter greens are designed specifically, the polyphenol content gives our body important information, and whether or not it's helping with digestion or, making our bile less viscous, there's a lot of different properties to bitter greens and things like that. There is a purpose. There is information in that tea or that coffee that my body would benefit from. And that's always the reframe, like understanding you can build up a tolerance to something that's bitter. Doesn't mean you have to eat copious amounts, but most, if not all of us, have an unhealthy relationship with sugar. And so those healthier sugar alternatives are still sugars. They're still, they may be cleaner. They may evoke less of an insulin response, but to me, it's still kind of masking a problem. That's why I'm not a huge proponent of a lot of like paleo and keto junk food, because it's still junk food. As long as people understand what it is, no judgment. But if you've got a problem with a lot of processed food and you just keep replacing it with healthier variations, there might still be an issue that you have to address.
Let's stick on the clean fasting here for a bit, because there are supplements that you talk about in the book, things that we can include during a fast that not only don't break the fast, they enhance it. And there's one in there we'll start with that is something I've never heard of, spermidine. So talk about what this is and how somebody could use that to take their fast to the next level.
Yeah, spermidine is an interesting, and despite the name, most spermidine now is derived from a wheat alternative, although I'm assured that it's safe for celiacs. I've been down a rabbit hole about spermidine for a while, but it upregulates one of the key benefits of fasting, which is autophagy. So this waste and recycling process in the body. And so spermidine is one of these, fasting mimetics. So they're designed to kind of upregulate and magnify the benefits. And so spermidine I find fascinating. Berberine is another one that's really fascinating to use. There's a lot of medicinal mushrooms that can be beneficial, always in the context of what else are they in. But I think it's interesting when people are looking to take fasting to another level. Obviously, you wait until you've got the basics down before you start adding in these things. But I think there are always hackers. There are always people that are looking to take or to magnify the benefits that they're getting in a really kind of benign way. And I do find that spermidine is of interest. I'm sensitive to gluten, so I've been a little reticent. I do actually have a bottle. I got a bottle through Dave Asprey. And so I find it really interesting. I've had a lot of questions, but I do kind of pause, and I'm trying to connect with an autophagy expert to try to bring her on my podcast to actually ask her all the questions that I have about spermidine in general. But originally it was derived from exactly what it sounds like. But berberine's probably the one that I think is much more accessible for a lot of people. Although all the research that I've read on berberine, you don't want to use it on a day that you've lifted, because it can actually inhibit like muscle protein synthesis. So for anyone that's listening that's not familiar with berberine, it is considered to be nature's metformin or nature's glucophage. And so I saw a lot of glucophage and metformin prescriptions over the years. But it's interesting that we have this medicinal plant that can help with insulin sensitivity as well. I do occasionally take that, especially if I've had a day with higher carbs and maybe not my healthy carbs. Maybe I've enjoyed like a piece of cake, or it's been a celebration of some kind. But there are definitely things that you can add to your fast that are fasting mimetics. So they magnify the impact of some of the fasting benefits.
You've brought up autophagy a couple times there. Can you talk more on a granular level what that is, why it's beneficial, and at what point during a fast does that kick in?
That is always the question, right? When does autophagy really get magnified? So autophagy is this waste and recycling process that goes in when we're in a non-fed state. And in opposition to that is something called mTOR. But I like for people to understand that just like we put trash out every week and the trash man comes and picks up the garbage, this is actually what's going on in the body. Our body will recycle diseased organelles, mitochondria, etc., that could potentially go on to be disease provoking, or it could be precancerous. But it's a really way of fine tuning efficiency in the body, we know that by the age of 40, most, if not all of us, have significant mitochondrial dysfunction. So let me back up and talk about the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of our cells. And so this is another way that we can continue to replenish. Mitophagy is the, recycling of disease, disordered mitochondria. Autophagy is referring to different types of cells. But it's with the understanding that these benefits occur when we're in an unfed state, and why it's so important to have a portion of the day when we're not eating. Now, if you look at the research, about 16 hours, obviously the longer you fast, the more autophagy, 16, 18, 24 hours, that's when you really see an upregulation. But it's not to suggest that if you fast 15 hours, you don't get benefits. And to me, it's not as if autophagy gets turned on and turned off. I think there's a continuum for autophagy, much like mTOR, that, you'll get to a point where you're still deriving benefits. But obviously, if you do a 24-hour fast, you're going to take out more garbage than you do with a 16-hour fast. But it doesn't negate the importance of having periods of the day when you're not eating. And I think the longer that I fast, because I've now been doing this for over 6 years, the more I realize that this is really the way that we can fine tune our bodies to work much more efficiently. In fact, I would be the first person to say that, even though this has gained popularity in the last, 5-10 years, this dates back, as I stated earlier, to ancestral times. And so it's really aligning our bodies with, I think, a more simplistic way of living our lives. We don't have to be governed by packing snacks and mini meals. I mean, I recall a time when I used to be the person drinking a protein shake going to the gym, and then drinking a protein shake coming home from the gym, because I was told you're supposed to have 40 grams of protein within a certain amount of time. And then I'd have all these not snacks, but meals prepared throughout the day at work, which made me laugh because more often than not, I didn't have time to eat them. But I think it's helpful for people to understand that autophagy is taking out the garbage in our bodies. Really efficient thing to do. Gets upregulated when we're in an unfed state. The longer you fast, the more autophagy, but that does not in any way mean that you are not still deriving benefits if you're fasting for less than 16 to 18 hours. That's always a common question. And I would love to be able to say definitive. It's 16 hours and 20 minutes that autophagy really kicks in. And a lot of researchers we're making assumptions that we believe this is the time frame in which that process really upregulates in a beneficial way.
And I'll add too, when it comes to autophagy, there's simple ways that you can upregulate that. Even having coffee in the morning, having ginger, having green tea, having cinnamon. So you can mix cinnamon and coffee like we talked about earlier, and that's going to ramp that up. So there's really simple things that people probably have at home that they can do to ramp that up starting tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. Or even doing things like high intensity interval training, anything that's a hormetic stress or a beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time can upregulate autophagy. And so I think it's important that fasting is not the only way that you can do that, because there are some people that are like, oh, I have to fast every day. And I just remind them, no, actually you don't. There's other ways you can do that, because what we're trying to do is improve mitochondrial health and improve that metabolic flexibility. And so things that stress the body in beneficial ways, like fasting or high intensity interval training or cryotherapy or infrared sauna, etc., or foods that we've talked about, can be hugely impactful.
And what do you think about stacking a number of those on top of each other while you're fasting? So doing, HIIT training, or I think you mentioned sauna there, a number of different things. What are your thoughts on layering those on top of each other and do we get more benefit that way?
Well, I think it depends on the individual. So remember what I said, so hormetic stressors are a beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time. So if you're sleeping well, you're managing your stress, you have plenty of energy. Yes, I do think, and I do enjoy personally, I enjoy stacking benefits. Like my husband and I have this kind of ritual that we do together. We'll do cryo and then infrared sauna in a fasted state. Sometimes we'll do HIIT before we do that. Obviously, to me, that works well for us, but for other people that may not feel right. And so I would experiment a little bit. Days that I do HIIT, I definitely will fast a little longer. And that's just personal preference. So I think that everyone should experiment to determine what feels right for them, because women that are still menstruating, still getting a menstrual cycle, they will feel the first 2 weeks of their menstrual cycle. So the follicular phase and estrogen predominates from the day of their bleeding till right before ovulation. Estrogen makes you a rock star. You can push your workouts, you can push your fasting windows, you can, go more ketogenic, low carb. Your body can withstand more strenuous exercise. And so I think the experimentation piece and understanding for women where they are in their menstrual cycle can allow them to like really lean in those first 2 weeks. And then as progesterone predominates in the luteal phase, you have to get a little bit, even though it's ironic, insulin, you're more insulin sensitive with estrogen predominates, a little more insulin resistant in when progesterone predominates. And so I remind people that as you get closer to menstruation, the 5 to 7 days, you want to back off on the accelerator of fasting. You don't want to do as intense exercise. Your body might actually need a little bit more high quality carbohydrate, like 100 calories, which isn't a whole lot. But understanding that there are phases in a woman's menstrual cycle when they can get away with a little bit more hormesis or hormetic stress. And so definitely women pushing more in the beginning of their menstrual cycle and, maybe doing yoga, maybe doing walks in nature, but not doing longer fasts right around their menstrual cycle.
I'm glad you covered that. I definitely want to get into the menstrual cycle. Also want to get into perimenopause and menopause, but we're going to pause on that, no pun intended. I want to stick on some of these adjuncts that people can add in when they're fasting. And another one you mentioned in the book is the C8 MCT oil. So again, this is something that you could put into your coffee in the morning. You could take a spoonful of it if you just want to shoot it back. Talk about what the benefits are there and how somebody, if you have any other ideas, how somebody could incorporate that.
Yeah, and it's a great question. So C8 is like the purest form of medium chain triglycerides, caprylic acid, and so quality is going to be important. Always the caution with MCT oil is MCT oil in the right amount can give you loose stools. So I always mention you want to start out like a teaspoon, see how you respond. I have friends that can do 2 or 3 tablespoons a day. I can stick with 1 teaspoon. And it's a fat, a beneficial fat that's processed very differently in the body, goes directly to the liver and gets processed. And so it can be helpful for boosting ketones. It can be helpful with energy production. Based on the research that I've looked at, 1 teaspoon in some coffee is not going to break your fast. So when people are doing an extended fast, I think it's completely fine. Or you're someone that's moving from a more processed diet, more sedentary, that can be a training wheel apparatus that you can add to your regimen so that you are not struggling as much. Like I always say, most of us don't experience hunger as efficiently as we should. And so that can be uncomfortable for some people. They haven't experienced that because they've been eating so regimentedly. So, the 3 meals a day plus snacks in between. But when we're talking about MCT oil, I think it's a really cool food that you can incorporate into your diet. Sometimes people will do it during their feeding window. They can use it with salad dressings. They can put it into beverages. It tends to be pretty benign without a lot of, without a lot of side effects, and generally will blend pretty easily into smoothies and things like that. But I do think you want to look for C8, which is the, most purest form of MCT oil, caprylic acid, and then slowly see how you respond to it. But I always suggest going low and slow so that if you have any digestive issues, you're not caught off guard.
All right, last adjunct I want to get into is the detox binder. So using things like charcoal while you're fasting to help eliminate some of the junk that's coming up during a fast. So talk about some of the different options there and how that works.
Yeah. And so one thing that's important about binders in general, you don't want to take them with other supplements or medication because it'll literally bond to everything it's exposed to. So in a fasted state, when you're not eating, you're not taking supplements, you're not taking any medication, I think that activated charcoal, apple pectin, certain types of dichotomous clay can be very beneficial. There's a brand, I'm not affiliated with them. There's a brand that I like called GI Detox that has a lot of nice properties, very gentle, and that can help bind to some of the crap that your body is actually packaging up and getting ready to get rid of. I probably don't use a binder every day. I probably use it a couple times a week. Obviously, if I'm doing a longer fast, I might actually use it, once or twice a day. This is just another layer. Like if you're interested, it's not necessary, but binders can be hugely impactful. In my ER nurse days, we used to use activated charcoal when people came in with an overdose. And so it literally acts like a sponge in the body. So if you get, for an example, if you get food poisoning, sometimes it's beneficial to take activated charcoal so it can bind to whatever you've been exposed to. Now, with this being said, again, you do not want to take binders around medication. So when I take my thyroid medicine, I don't take a binder. I make sure I'm way far away from medication. Or if I've had a supplement that I need to be on, I make sure that the binder is taken way away from that. Typically, the rule of thumb is you can take a binder 30 to 60 minutes before a meal. So if you're at the tail end of your fast, or 2 hours after a meal. So if you're planning on doing a longer fast and you want to get that on board, you can take it 2 hours after eating meal. So if you're 2 hours into a fast, that's actually a good time to take it without any cause of concern that you're going to soak up something that you don't want to, like your medication. I always say my thyroid medication is a good example. I want to make sure my body can break that down and use it.
Cynthia, I think at this point, a good framework for the next part of our conversation is to talk about, you mentioned people being interested in what you're eating. And this is something I'm sure that changes and pivots over time. But let's talk about where you're at now with when you break your fast, what you're eating, and then we can use, again, that as a platform to dive into different areas and talk about different aspects of fasting and diet.
Yeah, I mean, right now I use the term carnivore-ish, and it's really because I eat a lot of animal-based protein. That's what works really well for my body. Whether it's bison or steak or pork or chicken or fish. I mean, I like to kind of mix things up. I really genuinely like vegetables, which is why I could never be full carnivore again. And the tail end of that is I was full carnivore after being hospitalized because nothing else worked for my digestive system. But I really like vegetables, and I actually like fruit, and I tolerate both really well. I do better on a leaner diet, so leaner cuts of meat, leaner cuts of fish. I don't do as well with a lot of healthy fats. So when I do have healthy fats, it's smaller portions, and that's just what makes me unique. And that's been a lot of trial and error over the last several years. So when I break a fast, I'm going to sit down with, today I had grilled bison and I had some hard boiled eggs. I'm going through an egg phase. I intermittently kind of go through an egg phase. I think I must need more choline in my diet. So I sat down and had a bison burger. I had 3 deviled eggs. I had some leftover broccolini, and that was my lunch, or when I broke my fast. And that to me is perfect. And I'll eat another bolus of food later this afternoon after, playing my mom role. But that's kind of what I've been working best with right now is a good amount of protein. I would say 100 to 110 grams of protein a day for me, just based on my ideal body weight. And then, as much non-starchy vegetables as I want. And I've been experimenting more with fruit. I had not been eating a lot of fruit for a while, but right now I'm in a berry phase. Lots of raspberries and blueberries are what I really enjoy. Even just green bananas. Like, I think bananas have been largely vilified, but I love a just green banana, and it probably makes me sound like a total weirdo, but that's when it's a lot less starchy. There's just something about it. Like, it's literally when it's just gone from greenish to a little bit yellow, that's perfect for me. And those are the things that work really well for me. And I always encourage people to experiment. See, are your satiety cues kind of met with the amount of protein that you're eating? For me, I am so full when I'm done eating. There's no way I could eat more food. It's interesting when I travel, though, I will say with full disclosure, I've started ordering a second thing of protein. Like, I was in a restaurant last month and I had a naked burger on my plate, and I looked at the waitress and I said, "Can I get a side of shrimp or some chicken?" Because this burger was so small. I'm not hitting that 40, 50, 60 grams of protein in that meal. So there's been a great deal of experimentation, but that's what works best for me right now. And definitely breaking my fast is with a protein dense meal, usually with some carbohydrate, but usually in the form of vegetables.
So you've really hit home the importance of protein when you break your fast. Let's talk about why that is. I think it was 40, 50, 60 grams. Why do you aim for so high? What is that doing for you?
Yeah. So for me, I'm very protective of my muscle. And the one thing that I have learned from being friends with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon over the last several years is that protein is so incredibly important. Our protein needs actually increase with age. It's not that they go away. My protein needs probably as a 51-year-old female are much more than they were even 10 years ago. So protein is important for me because I'm aiming for 110 grams a day. And I kind of teach people that you want more protein than you probably realize. So I want to make sure that each meal has 50 to 60 grams of protein. That's ideally what I'm shooting for. Number one, for supportive muscle protein synthesis. Number two, for satiety, because the one thing that people may or may not realize is that as you are losing estrogen in perimenopause towards the tail end and into menopause, and as this hormone called follicular stimulating hormone is going up, it will drive the need for protein needs will continue to increase. If you don't get your protein need met, guess what? You're going to crave fat and carbohydrates. And it's important to understand that those things tend to be hyperpalatable, meaning if I sit down and have a bunch of chips and guacamole, although delicious, that is not going to give my body the macros that it needs to be able to continue to build muscle. What's important to understand about muscle is that muscle helps with insulin sensitivity. So as we are losing muscle north of 40, this process of sarcopenia, our bodies are effectively replacing lean muscle tissue with adipose tissue. Adipose tissue, although, if you're looking at a filet mignon, which is, lean muscle, a ribeye, although delicious, that's not what we want our muscles to turn into, because we start to lose muscle insulin sensitivity, where we'll become more insulin resistant. There are all these hormonal changes that are occurring, especially for women as they are transitioning from perimenopause to menopause. And so for me, it's helping individuals understand, whether you're a man or a woman, andropause is a real thing, menopause is a real thing. And the way to get ahead of that is to make sure you're eating enough protein, you're getting high quality sleep, and you're lifting heavy things. And that always seems to be a triggering kind of trio, because people will say, I don't want to lift weights. And I'm like, I don't care if you do body weight exercise. I've got my, 76-year-old mom doing body weight exercise, and she's slowly kind of improving upon her sarcopenic muscle. But it's helpful to understand this is where me as an intermittent fasting expert, I will differentiate from the longevity experts, because to me, it is far more important to be hitting those protein metrics than it is to be having just one meal a day, than it is to be continuing to lose muscle mass as I get older. I think that on a lot of different levels, these frank conversations are important so that people understand those hormones that I'm referring to, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, whether it's cortisol, melatonin, as these things are changing throughout our lifetime, they can positively or negatively impact how we are aging, whether that's accelerated. If you're losing muscle and you're losing insulin sensitivity, you're increasing inflammation, you're increasing oxidative stress. We have a whole generation of providers and also women who are fearful to talk about hormones, let alone talk about replacing hormones. And so helping people understand very transparently, because I'm very comfortable talking about what I've done that's worked and what I've done that has not worked. I think it's helpful for people just to start the conversation with, if you want to maintain insulin sensitivity and you want to maintain lean muscle, you have to change your relationship with protein, and you have to change your relationship with the types of exercise that you're doing, and also really focusing on sleep. And those three things can be very, very helpful to ensure that you remain metabolically healthy. And I think that's something that you and I really share, is a passion for helping people understand what are the things you can do to help support your health as you're getting older.
Well, I definitely want to take some time later on in our conversation to talk about metabolic health. And you mentioned insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance. I really want to get into those as well. But before we do, I want to make sure we really get into some of the nuances of what you're eating and when you're eating. So we kind of have an idea now of the food piece, but let's just go right through your day. I think that'd be helpful, and talk about what you're having before you break your fast, when you break your fast. You mentioned exercise, that being a big piece of all of this. When are you exercising? I really want us, before we get into the next piece, to have a good feeling for what a day looks like.
Okay, so this is a typical day in my life. Obviously, it's a great question. I'm happy to answer it. But remember, this is what works for me at this stage in my life. So this may not work for someone else. So I'm typically up between 5 and 6 a.m. Usually the first thing I do is I get my dogs out for a walk. And it's important that I get out as the sun is kind of rising. So my dogs get anywhere from a 1.5 to 2 mile walk. And then I'm getting sunlight exposure on my retinas. I'm not wearing sunglasses, depending on how hot or cold it is. That's how long the walk is. I come home, I feed them. I have teenagers, they feed themselves and go off to school. And then usually whatever exercise I'm doing that day, whether it's a day where I'm doing more recovery work, or if it's a day I'm lifting, I try to aim to lift 2 to 3 days a week minimum. I also really like doing Pilates. I probably should be doing that twice a week because I actually mentally that's good for me because it's challenging, but in different ways. I get quite a bit of walking in. So for me, I'm aiming to have 7,000 to 8,000 steps done in the morning because that kind of allows me to kind of gauge how much more physical activity I need during the day. After I've gotten my workout done, I really love laying on a PEMF mat. And if anyone's wondering what that is, it's a mat that has ions that are actually helping to support the mitochondria. It's incredibly relaxing. And for me, it kind of reminds my body, depending on the settings, okay, this is kind of a little bit of a recovery before I take a shower. So usually in the shower by 9 o'clock in the morning, shower, get myself ready for the day, whatever it is I'm doing, household stuff, if it's laundry or other things. I am always, as soon as I get up in the morning, I'm drinking water. I have a little bit of mild dysautonomia. I don't have POTS, so I don't have postural orthostatic hypotension that a lot of individuals do. But I've always craved electrolytes and I never knew why. And so I've been working with a new functional medicine doctor. And the first thing he said, he just mentioned a couple things about my history. And he's like, I think you actually have mild dysautonomia and some degree of hypermobility. And I've got some gut stuff. And so he said, you kind of created this triad that he sees. And so for me, electrolytes are an important part of my day. I drink them throughout the day. Obviously, in a fasted state, it's the unflavored variety. But I add a lot of, when I tell you a lot of electrolytes, a lot. And so I'm drinking that all the way throughout the day. I usually now break my fast a little earlier than I used to. Usually 9:30, 10:30, 11 is usually my sweet spot, depending on what's on my calendar. That's when I'll sit down and have 50, 60 grams of protein. I'll have those non-starchy vegetables. My one vice in life is dark chocolate. And so I allow myself to have a little bit of dark chocolate every day. And I have zero shame about that. There's a lot of things I don't eat. But I love dark chocolate, and that's something that makes me happy. Get a little bit of a dopamine hit, and then I can kind of tackle my day. And most of my day is working in my business. If it's a Monday through Friday, I usually start to kind of gear down around 3:30 because I have a kiddo that has to be picked up from school. And I may or may not, eat before I pick him up or eat after. It just really depends on how the day is structured. On the weekends, we're very diligent about family meals. During the week, it's because we have so many different schedules, sports events, things. It's kind of a grab and go culture, which used to not be the case. But now that I have teenagers, we've had to kind of make some accommodations. So that last meal could be at 4 o'clock. It could be at 5 o'clock. It could be at 6 o'clock. And again, I'll have the same kind of plug and play, 50 to 60 grams of protein, more non-starchy vegetables, lots of water. During my feeding window, I will have electrolytes with some stevia in them, and I'm okay with that. I love fresh squeezed lemon in my water. I'm happy to talk about all the electrolytes I take because I try a couple different ways to get them all in. I can tell by my HRV, my heart rate variability, how much hydration I've gotten. And so that's a typical day. And then usually I'm gearing down for bed. I like to be upstairs, maybe not in bed, maybe not per se in bed, 9-ish. I like to be in bed, lights out by 9:30 or 10. This week was unusual that I had, my mom was in town. My mom doesn't go to bed early. And then my older son had a lacrosse game. And so I think I was in bed at like 11:15. And I definitely feel differently when I get up, when I go to bed later. So that's a typical day. 2 usually large boluses of food. Yes, I'm very cognizant to ensure I'm getting plenty of food in. And some days, I would say the average day, I get 2 large boluses of food, which sounds terrible, 2 large meals. And then at least one day a week, I refer to as a refeeding day. And refeeding makes me sound like I'm an animal in the zoo, but it's really a day I will have a bit more protein. I will account for another meal. And it could be, maybe that's a day I have a protein shake and then 2 large meals. Or maybe it's a day I just sit down and I'm kind of going through this egg phase, as I mentioned. Maybe I have four eggs, or maybe I have an omelet. Maybe I have 5 eggs. Just depends on how hungry I am. But it's definitely with the understanding that I'm very kind of aware of how my body feels, how's my recovery from workouts, how's my sleep quality. But the hydration and protein are 2 very consistent things that I really actively work towards. I have a 60-ounce glass pitcher that sits on my counter. And that's how I'm able to kind of get a sense for how much water I'm consuming throughout the day. So the expectation is by the time I go to bed, I have finished that. So I'm drinking it throughout the day, which I think is really just very important for me. As an example, I was out in Denver. I live on the East Coast, but I was out in Denver last month. And my mom grew up in Denver. I've gone to Denver maybe not hundreds of times, many times throughout my lifetime because I have family there. I had an altitude headache. I struggled. My HRV was in the toilet. My sleep quality was off. And it was because I could not catch back up for the hydration piece. And so for 3 days, I had the headache, the hydration, electrolytes. I was doubling up on electrolytes. And it was interesting to see that at altitude, I was really struggling because I travel quite a bit and I don't normally have that much trouble. But it was really interesting to see the net impact on how I felt because I just couldn't get ahead of the curve. But generally speaking, that's kind of how my days are structured. Now, if I'm traveling, obviously different. Weekends are different because it's so important for us to sit down with our children and eat. And it's a slower pace. Like during the week, it's very purposeful. It's like, okay, I have 30 minutes. I'm going to sit down and eat my meal. And I think it's very important that I don't rush through eating. I don't like to eat in my car. I don't like to eat at my desk. I think it's important to just unplug. Maybe I read a book. Just very, very important to make sure my body is relaxed when I'm consuming food so that it can properly kind of assimilate and break down what I'm eating.
This is great. I love all the detail here. I think we went over some of this last time we talked, but this obviously is always changing, like I mentioned before, and we're getting into all kinds of detail we haven't covered. Couple areas I really want to make sure we dive deeper into, one being the electrolyte piece. They kept coming up, and I don't remember specifically them coming up last time. So I'm curious, is this a newer addition for you or just something you're making more of a priority in the last bit? And then it sounds like you're having them throughout the day. Are you drinking plain water too, or is it electrolytes all the time?
It is electrolytes all the time. It's interesting. Even before intermittent fasting, because of cardiology, because of my background and knowing what I knew about my patients, I was like, I would recommend salting their food, which was completely contrary to what we're typically telling our patients, high quality salt. But I crave salt and my adrenals are healthy. That's not the issue. I think I've always needed them. And I intuitively understood that. Because this new physician that I'm working with, he laughed when we asked me what I ate in a day. And he said, I think it's really interesting that you are this attuned to your body. You understand how much better you feel when you're consuming electrolytes as opposed to not. So when I look at my day, I literally have, I don't know if you've ever heard of Quinton ampules. So you can get hypotonic, hypertonic, isotonic water. They're little ampules that you break them off. I add that to my water, in an unfed state because there's nothing that's flavoring them. It's pretty benign. I add element to my water in an unfed and a fed state. So obviously the unsweetened element is pretty salty. So that has to be diluted in a lot of water. But yeah, all day long I'm drinking electrolytes. I even have other trace minerals that I'll add. And what I found is interesting is that I sleep better. My HRV is better. I'm a lot more alert when I'm hydrating like this all during the day. But I understand now that there's something unique about my physiology that I actually need more than the average person. And someone had once said, well, is it because you're low carb, because you've got these renal losses of sodium? And I said, well, no, I wouldn't say I'm consistently low carbohydrate. For listeners, if they're familiar, when you go lower carbohydrate, you're actually breaking down and depleting glycogen stores. And with glycogen being broken down, you'll get renal losses of sodium and other electrolytes. And I said, I can tell if I'm really low carb, I can tell in my body, I'll just start urinating more often. I said, that's not what this is about. I think this is just what's unique to me and my lifestyle. But I find that fasting in general, if someone's fasting and not using electrolytes, it can be a big game changer. People just feel better. They're more mentally clear. They have less cramping. And so the longer I've done this, the more I've just realized is that this might be my magical unicorn properties, is that I consume a lot of electrolytes throughout the day, but not in a way that's raised my blood pressure or not in a way that inhibits my ability to go to bed at night. I don't wake up to urinate. So I know I'm hitting the right threshold for me. But I acknowledge if someone were to see because my mother was asking a lot of questions. If someone were to see what I do in a given day, they would probably be surprised.
You mentioned Element there. They're a longtime sponsor of the show. I'm actually drinking Element right now. Big fan. How many packs would you go through a day?
At least 3, sometimes 4. And that's on top of Quinton ampules. That's on top of trace minerals. I've even got my physician even has me on some vitamin C. So I've got like a lot of mineral support just in general. And to his credit, actually, since he added a couple new mineral supplements, I actually feel really good. So I'm like, okay, this is actually working towards that. But, when I was in Denver, I was consuming probably 8 a day because I was doubling up because I knew what was happening. I was like, my body's dehydrated and it's not acclimating to altitude as readily as I thought it would. I was like, okay, I will never be, probably not going to Machu Picchu anytime soon, which is even a higher elevation. But, as to your point, I think that for each one of us, it's finding that sweet spot. I have some people that will just consume 1 element a day, and that's as much as they tolerate. And so I think it's the power of the N of 1 and just understanding that, each one of us has kind of like unique needs that if we're tuning into what our body's trying to communicate can really make a big difference. And for me, electrolytes are total game changers. So when I travel, especially when I travel overseas or I'm doing longer trips, that's how I can kind of gauge how much water I'm consuming. So I always bring that glass container, which, to my teenagers is so embarrassing. They're like, there goes mom with her electrolytes. I'm like, that's right.
So just to make sure I'm clear, this big container has the Quinton ampules, which is something I'm going to look into. I haven't heard of them before. The Element, and then trace minerals. What kind of trace minerals?
So it's just a product that has, bioavailable potassium, sodium, magnesium, and chloride. And the trace minerals are things like manganese and lithium. I take a separate vitamin C supplement. And you may or may not know, vitamin C is one of these supplements that if you take too much, it can actually give you diarrhea. So it's like this. I take a capsule because the powders, I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. It's a little less specific. So, for me, it's finding what's the right combination for me. But I acknowledge when I say to other people, this is what I do, it's like, wow, that's a lot of different steps. However, because I feel good, that's why it just reinforces like this is physician sanctioned. So objectively, my physician has signed off on this with the acknowledgement that he's like, you figured out for yourself what you need, like your little like cocktail of electrolytes that you consume during the day that work best for you. Oh, and I love lemon. So I have a lot of lemon squeezed into my water. For some reason, that's like perfect.
And what do you use for a base of the water? Is it like a Berkey water filter system or reverse osmosis? Just since we've gotten into the nuances here, let's get the full picture.
So it's interesting that you asked that question. So it's always filtered water, but I had our water tested and my new functional medicine doctor wanted an even more involved test. There was like 8 different vials of water that had to be tested. And so I'm still waiting to get that report because he wanted that report to then determine what we were going to get. I just wanted to get a whole house aquasana system. My husband didn't want anything on our counter. So our Berkey did not make its way from our last house. And so we're kind of in this gray area right now, waiting to figure that out. The first test that we did, which he felt like didn't test enough things, showed us some cadmium. So cadmium is a heavy metal. And he felt like there was probably the area of Virginia that I live in there's probably a strong likelihood there's more heavy metals than what we realize. So to this date, I don't yet have that report. I'm told it should be back next week. It's like takes like 3 weeks to test all these things. But literally there's this massive box that shows up that you then have to put all these 8 vials of things, out of the kitchen sink, out of this other sink. We have a brand new house. So I don't anticipate we're going to have any contaminants that were related to copper pipes or things like that. So it's been a very interesting journey. And I just say this really humbly, like as a clinician, going through this process has been very interesting.
Let's talk about the stevia piece. You mentioned when you're in your fasting window, you're having the unflavored electrolytes, which opens up the bigger question, stevia, how do you feel about it in general? And then, because I'm somebody, I mentioned the Element big fan, I have the flavored ones. I actually don't consume the unflavored ones only because I like all the different flavors, even when I'm fasting. So this is probably going to be a new piece for me to implement when I'm fasting to get the unflavored ones. Why does that matter?
Well, I think this is there's definitely debate, certainly on social media. Some people will say, well, it doesn't evoke a blood sugar response, so it's irrelevant. But I think more about a cephalic phase insulin response. So this physiologic response to things that are sweet on our tongue. And when I talk about a clean fast incorporates things that I'm pretty certain are not going to evoke an insulin response in the body. And so I think this is very nuanced. Obviously, if you are metabolically healthy, insulin sensitive, I don't think you really have to worry about the nuances of having a little bit of stevia in a fasting window. But most of my people that follow me and are in programs are not metabolically healthy, or they're kind of teetering on that edge. And I do think it can be a differentiator between, clean fasting versus maybe it's a little nuanced type of fasting. So I think for an individual, if you're insulin sensitive, probably not a big deal to have a packet of stevia sweetened element. I want to be really clear about that. I don't beat myself up. If I want orange salt, I'm going to have it, and I'm not going to feel guilty or badly about it. I think that it's important to just understand the context when we're talking about non-nutritive sweeteners. So there was a study that was done in Cell last fall, kind of looking at non-nutritive sweeteners. And it was in a mouse study, and it was looking at saccharin, which made me laugh because I was like, was it like 1980s, like Tab soda? That's like what my grandmother used to consume. Like, who's using saccharin? They were comparing that with aspartame and sucralose. And so to me, aspartame and sucralose are these artificial sweeteners. Those I think I would definitely not recommend people consume. They're in a lot of beverages. They're in a lot of shakes. They're in a lot of bars that are out there that seem to be kind of benign. And I say seem to be benign, and I'll put that in air quotes. And then there was also stevia that was used in this study. And the kind of first thing that it was looking at in a mouse model was how do these sweeteners impact oral glucose tolerance? And within 28 days, there was a negative net impact on oral glucose tolerance, and there was a negative net impact on the gut microbiome. Now, this is a mouse or mice. This is not a human, but when we're looking at animal models, we could likely kind of extrapolate that there could be the potentiality of negative interactions on the gut microbiome and our insulin sensitivity or glucose tolerance for that matter. But I don't kind of put stevia in the same bucket as saccharin, sucralose, aspartame. I want to be really clear about that. And I think if you're having 3 or 4 element a day, that's very different than someone that's having a lot of highly processed hyperpalatable foods with a lot of artificial sweeteners in them. And I think it's also, are you someone that's very susceptible to artificial sweeteners? Some people, it just drives the desire for more and more and more and more and more. And I think for individuals that are susceptible, they have to really abstain or really limit their consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners along with traditional sweeteners. And so it really begs the question of, you have to know yourself. I always like Vinnie Tortorich because he has, the no sugar, no grains. That's kind of his mindset. And I was at a talk that he gave last year. We both spoke at an event, and someone said, "What's your favorite artificial sweetener?" And he said, "None." He said, because all you're doing is chasing a problem with another problem. Meaning, if you've got a sugar problem, you're better off limiting or eliminating the sugar than trying to find the latest and greatest, whether it's monk fruit, a thyrotol, stevia, etc. And so I think we really just have to know ourselves. So again, just kind of getting back to the original intent of answering the question was, if you're not insulin sensitive, if you're dealing with, hyperinsulinemia, or you've got a high blood sugar, then it probably matters what you're consuming in a fasted state, significantly so. If you're metabolically healthy, you're insulin sensitive, I wouldn't worry about a package of Element. And I'm just using Element as the example. Obviously, there's other things that we could use. But I think that's really how it gets really nuanced. And do I on occasion have orange Element in a fasted state and feel fine? Absolutely. But I think it's always in the context. But for me personally, I'm having a combination of unflavored and flavored orange salt. That's my favorite. throughout my day. And so I think that it's really big picture. Like, I think sometimes people can get so fixated on minutia that they miss the big picture. And the big picture is, are you insulin sensitive? The answer is yes. Then worry a whole lot less. If you're not, then you got to work on those things, because it can make a big difference in the success that you have.
As you're going through what you eat, when you eat, and you gave us kind of a typical week saying things were a bit different on the weekend, one of the things that jumped out at me was the fact that you have this one day throughout the week where you actually up the protein. And for a lot of us, it already, I'm sure, sounded like you're having quite a bit of protein on a typical day. One thing you didn't get into, though, is why you do that. So what's the reason for that once a week?
Well, I think because I've been fasting for so many years now. It's kind of, you can make the argument I could have more carbohydrates that day, or I can have more protein, but it's designed to kind of stimulate a little bit more muscle protein synthesis, but also remind my body I'm not trying to starve it. Oftentimes women come to me, and I'll use a woman as an example. Perfect example is a middle-aged woman. She's weight loss resistant. If a little bit of fasting is good, more is better. They've been doing OMAD for years. They're mad at me because I'm telling them they're not eating enough food. They're going to break their metabolism effectively. And we have to kind of reverse diet, go back to eating more food, because they've gotten to a point where they're completely plateaued, but they've not been eating enough food for years and years and years. And what ends up happening is their body's like, well, heck, I'm not going to get much food today, so I'm not going to burn any extra calories. There's no point in doing that. And so I think it really begs the conversation about making sure you're eating enough food. So for me, it's really kind of giving myself a little, maybe it's 100 calories more. It's not a ton more protein, but kind of pushing that metric up, and working with women that have effectively gotten to a point where they're eating 800 calories a day, maybe 500 calories a day if they're eating one meal. They've just gotten to a point where they've widgeted down so much. That can be destructive. And this is when there's this nuance of some degree of disordered eating, that can play a role. I don't know if you're seeing that in some of the, talking to some of the guests, if they're seeing similar situations with patients. I have some people who are pathologically fearful to eat more than one meal a day. And I always say one meal a day is fine around holiday, vacation, you ate too much, you don't feel good, you're bloated. One meal a day is not a sustainable strategy to be able to hit those protein macros, to not end up losing muscle mass at the expense of insulin sensitivity. And so for me, a lot of why I do that is to kind of push that threshold up. Now, have I ever gotten to a point where I had to kind of adjust my macros and make sure I was pushing the envelope? That's why that protein piece is so important. I don't want my body to think that I'm trying to be neglectful, or I don't track macros, I don't track calories, but I generally have a very good sense of how much I'm eating. I'll give you a good example. 2 days ago, super busy day, didn't stop and have lunch, totally unusual for me. My son had a lacrosse game, didn't eat enough for dinner. And by the next day I was like, I'm grumpy. I know I'm grumpy because I didn't eat enough food. I definitely can't exist like that. So your body will definitely let you know. But I think from the perspective of, if you think you probably aren't eating enough food, you probably aren't. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And how many individuals will share with me across social media, they've been doing OMAD for years, males and females. And I'm like, you're probably in a significant caloric deficit, and that could be detrimental. And so really having those honest conversations, even if the potentiality exists that it's going to be provocative or make someone uncomfortable, or, I used to be the co-host of another podcast, and we would sometimes get those questions, and I would just say, well, if you don't think you're eating enough, you probably aren't. And so I think more often than not, we've already answered the questions for ourselves without having to ask it. It's like, we already know, we just need the validation.
Using the dogs coming through there as a segue into you finding your way into the health and wellness space, I think, Cynthia, for you, you were interested in starting to study law, and then you got a dog, and this was something that helped your trajectory course correct into becoming a nurse practitioner. So I'd love for you to talk about that, getting into the health and wellness space, and how your dog was involved with that.
Yeah. So I was pre-law all through undergrad, got into law school. And then when I started looking at the ROI, I was like, okay, I'm going to spend this much money on a private law school, and I'm going to get out and maybe make this much money. And it didn't seem like it didn't seem like it was a good investment. And at the time, I'd always wanted a dog. I had divorced parents who very responsibly said, there's no way we can handle a dog. And so I got out of college, and the first thing I did was get a dog. I got a rescue. And she changed everything for me. You know, I realized I was really interested in medicine, initially veterinary medicine, until I realized I'm allergic to cats in a horrible way. There was no way that would have been feasible. And I went back to school and took pre-med classes. And in one of my classes, my professor, because I was probably 2 years older than most of the undergrads, he was like, "What are you doing in here?" And so I explained, "I'm going to go to med school." He's like, "You don't want to go to med school. You want to go." He's like, "You want to have a quality of life." And I was like, "Yeah, you're right." And he said, "My sister's a nurse practitioner. I want you to meet her." The irony is a lot of people in my family are nurses and doctors. And I think I automatically rejected that as an option because I didn't want to do what everyone else did. And so that's the complete irony. But one of the best things that could have ever happened to me, because when I started applying to they're called bridge programs. So in order to be a nurse, you have to have a nursing degree, which I didn't have. And so I got both a bachelor's and a master's. And a master's was the terminal degree for nurse practitioners 20 years ago. And so I was accepted into a dual program. At that time, I was really interested in HIV and AIDS research. And so I went to the #1 medical school campus for that. And I will tell everyone and anyone, best decision I ever made was not going to law school, because once I got into my medical training, I was so happy, so intellectually stimulated. I loved being of service to others. And so that's the direction I went down. I was an ER nurse. I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. And then I went into cardiology as an NP. And probably everyone that's listening saying, how in the heck did you get from there to where you are now? And I think a lot of it had to do, one of my children had life-threatening food allergies. And I read a book by Robin O'Brien called The Unhealthy Truth. And I had the opportunity to connect with her last year, which was like so just a very emotional experience for me, because she really did encourage me to change the trajectory of everything I was doing. I started getting much more interested in the role of food as medicine. I started a doctoral program and hated it. I did a wellness coaching program, which didn't really excite me. And then ultimately I did a functional nutrition program, and that lit me up and really encouraged me to leave clinical medicine 6 years ago as of April 1st. And to start my own business. And for anyone that's listening and wondering, like, how did you get from there to where you are? I had no business plan. I just told my husband I knew I'd be successful. So I'm not sure if that was ignorance or just supreme confidence. But almost instantaneously, I started attracting women just like myself who were feeling like late 30s, early 40s, that our needs were not being met in the medical system. We were being sidelined. We were given options to control our hormones with synthetic hormones, an IUD, an ablation, or a hysterectomy, none of which were of interest to me at all. And so life imitates art. I started attracting all these women. I ultimately decided to do a TED Talk in 2018, did one talk and then was offered a second. And the second one, ironically enough, is the one that I'm known for. And there was no strategy behind the topics I chose to speak on, but I was asked to speak on fasting in women because this particular venue felt like they weren't serving women's needs enough. And so the rest is history. That's kind of how I've gotten from there to here, never realizing that what I would really be known for is intermittent fasting in women, but very grateful to be able to speak on women's behalf and advocate for them and empower women to have better information so that they don't feel so lost in middle age, perimenopause and beyond, as I usually say.
I think it was about the time that you transitioned from practice to, doing things solo that you found intermittent fasting. Because I think earlier you mentioned around 6 years ago, or just over 6 years, you found intermittent fasting. And this changed your life. So go to the part of the story where you find that, what you're going through, with your health challenge at the time, and how that changed everything.
Yeah, I mean, I was always very fortunate. I've always been thin. Even after having kids, I never had problems losing weight. And all of a sudden, I was doing all the wrong things that I thought were all the right things. I was not sleeping enough. I had a husband who did a lot of international travel. I had 2 young kids. I had a very stressful job. Cardiology, as anyone could imagine, you're dealing with the sickest, most acutely ill patient population. And I was doing really intense exercise, like conditioning classes at 5:30 in the morning, and probably not fueling my body the way that I needed to. And perimenopause is like a leveling playing ground. Like you think you're doing all the right things, but all of a sudden you start gaining weight, you can't sleep, you're anxious. And it's all because of these fluctuations in hormones. Your ovaries are producing less progesterone, which impacts your sleep and anxiety and depression. And all of a sudden you're estrogen dominant. So you're feeling puffy and bloated and your gut's a mess. And so, I came to fasting out of the desire to feel better. And I felt better so quickly that it started working into all of the teachings and education that I was doing with my patients. And then, pivoted into me starting programs that incorporated intermittent fasting as well. So I look at it as a blessing. I really came to it out of a desire to feel better. And then I came to realize that, if I feel this good, I'm sure every other woman or man for that matter deserves to feel this good. And so it became an easy strategy to incorporate, largely because on so many levels, a lot of what I had been taught, even as a clinician, was just so blatantly wrong. Like the concept of heart healthy grains and, the food guide pyramid or the my plate paradigm that really is focused on like 55% carbohydrates. And I'm like, when a woman starts entering perimenopause, you become less insulin sensitive, even if you're at a healthy weight. You start replacing some of your muscle tissue. So it's muscle loss with aging, which is sarcopenia. You start replacing some muscle with adipose tissue. You become much more metabolically inflexible. And this is, the kind of the, I always say it's the start of this metabolic inflexibility piece. And so on a lot of levels, all the information we're giving women is no longer working for them. Like there is no concept of heart healthy grains, and we don't eat enough protein. We eat the wrong types of fats. We eat too many of the wrong types of carbohydrates. And so a lot of the training about perimenopause and menopause is retraining us to understand prioritizing sleep, doing the right types of exercise, which includes strength training, absolutely critically important, anti-inflammatory nutrition, working on stress management, which does not involve 2 minutes of meditation once a day. Like you really do have to work at it. And so as I've kind of navigated these years on my own, it's validated or invalidated things that I had known before. And so the beautiful thing is I feel like now I've gotten to a point where I can really advise like bioindividuality rules for everyone, either gender, but really empowering women to understand, like, let's lean in, like, where are you in your menstrual cycle and should you be fasting? Or if you're menopausal, how are you feeling? If your sleep is terrible and you're over exercising, please don't add in intermittent fasting for anyone. If you don't sleep well, I always say intermittent fasting is not going to save you if you can't sleep properly through the night. And we could unpack like all the changes that occur in the body when you don't have sufficient REM or deep sleep, and the impact on leptin and ghrelin and glucose and insulin response, and how critically and foundationally important sleep is. So on a lot of levels, I'm truly grateful because intermittent fasting gave me back my life. Like I say all the time, I feel more energetic than I did 15 years ago. And I was always healthy on the outside. But I really think it's the way that our bodies are designed to thrive. We are not designed to be eating all day long. We really aren't. And this is such a huge problem here in the States and other westernized countries.
Let's stay on perimenopause and really unpack this. I think this is an area that you can really provide a ton of value for us. And as somebody, who's been through it and been trying all this different strategies, first of all, what age does perimenopause start, or what time frame can people expect to enter that?
Well, so I think, to be honest with you, we say 5 to 10 years preceding menopause. And so the average woman in the United States goes through menopause at 51. So a lot of women are in perimenopause in their late 30s. So 37, 38, early 40s, you're there. There's no question. I have women that argue all the time. No, I'm not in perimenopause. I was like, okay. Statistically, I can tell you that you are. However, what starts to happen initially is our ovaries are as old as we are. Unlike men, we don't replenish sperm every 3 days. So if you're 40, your ovaries are 40 years old. You're probably no longer ovulating every month, even if you're getting a cycle. Your progesterone is starting to fluctuate and wane. And that's really the beginning, is this decreasing amount of circulating progesterone from the ovaries. Our adrenals do pick up the slack. But remember, our adrenals are an emergency backup system. But in our over-harried existences, more often than not, people are in a constant state of sympathetic dominance, meaning our bodies are running a marathon, even if we're just stuck in traffic or frustrated with day-to-day activities. So this imbalance in the autonomic nervous system, so parasympathetic, rest and repose, sympathetic, I'm being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. It's an important distinction. So a little more leaning into the adrenals, which means we have to be managing our stress and getting enough sleep. We also get this relative estrogen dominance. And what this means is, because there's not as much circulating progesterone. We'll get a little bit estrogen dominant, but this is also impacted by the estrogens in our environment. So estrogen mimicking chemicals that are in our environment, personal care products, and food are all hugely impactful into that estrogen bucket that we have in our bodies. So one of the first things that we'll start to see as progesterone is waxing and waning, sleep, depression, anxiety, those are the first common symptoms that people see. Number two is that because estrogen predominates, estrogen is this proliferative hormone. So we may feel a little more fleshy. We may feel like our weight goes up. We may experience much heavier periods. I used to call them the crime scene periods. I used to pray I wouldn't get a cycle while I was rounding in the hospital. You may have breast tenderness. You may have acne breakouts. It is clearly letting people know that you are starting to go into this reverse puberty stage. And so for more often than not, what happens is when women are going through these symptoms, what they get offered are antidepressants. If they're lucky, they might get an offer to put them on progesterone, even transdermal absorbed through the skin. But if you go to the average GYN, what they are going to offer you are synthetic hormones to control your hormones. They're going to offer you an IUD, and IUDs come in different formulations. Some are copper, some are progestin. Number 3 is an ablation. So they go in and they cauterize the inside of your uterus, or they can just take everything out and do a hysterectomy. And so understanding that there are things we can do that are foundational before we ever get to the point of needing hormonal therapy. And by no means am I suggesting that there aren't women out there. There's no judgment. If you decide that's the right decision for yourself, that is absolutely acceptable. But I find that sometimes something as benign as the sleep piece, stress management, removing inflammatory foods, working on gut health, and that involves a good amount of testing. Like I love the GI map, which is a DNA-based stool test. I like the Dutch. I like to look at serum labs, removing toxins, because this sometimes seems like a very intangible subject. People don't really want to know what's in their food. They don't really want to know what's in their water. But I always say, pick one thing, start with one thing. Maybe you clean up your deodorant. I mean, every little change has a huge impact. And then really looking at food quality, like where are you sourcing your food from? I do believe that there's value in buying organic fruits and vegetables, just for even the exposure to glyphosate and insecticides and herbicides and the net impact of how that impacts the gut microbiome. So from my perspective, the people that do the best managing and navigating perimenopause and menopause are the ones that dial in on the lifestyle stuff. And we know that the people that have the worst symptoms heading into menopause are the ones with the biggest issues related to insulin resistance and blood sugar dysregulation. And so a lot of what my job is laying the foundation so that if they then get to a point where they're like, I've done all these things, everything's dialed in, I think I need a little bit of progesterone. There's no shame in that. I take progesterone every night. In fact, I laugh. It's like the thing that makes sure my sleep is really, really solid. And there is room for hormonal replacement therapy, but you have to lay the foundation first. Otherwise, you will never, ever get to the results that you want. And I think I'm actually grateful that now more and more, a lot of physician researchers are speaking out against the Women's Health Initiative, which ironically enough, when I was finishing up my graduate program, that's when the Women's Health Initiative research came out that really gave people, not only clinicians, but also women, great fear of taking hormones causing cancer, which has been disproven. But I think it's important for women to know there are a lot of options that don't start with prescription medications. You may eventually get there, and that's okay. There's no shame in that. But that process of perimenopause is 5 to 10 years, depending on the individual. I really think it's a 10-year journey. Retrospectively, average age of menopause is 51. That's 12 years without a menstrual cycle. I have several clients right now who get mad. They're thinking they're almost there, and then they'll get a cycle and like, dang, I have to start that clock all over again. But for many years, you may not even be ovulating, but getting a menstrual cycle. But there's lots of ways to tackle symptoms that don't involve prescription medications. A lot of it is lifestyle management. And in fact, the women who do the best navigating those years are the ones that take all those things I just mentioned into account. And some of that is also the fasting piece, eating less frequently, because we also don't need the same amount of food we needed at 18. We're no longer growing, hopefully. But I remind people that eating within a window, whether it's 6 hours, 8 hours, etc., 12 hours, if you're still getting a cycle right before menstruation, can be hugely impactful.
Well, let's go deeper into the intermittent fasting piece at that stage. So, if somebody has taken care of the lifestyle stuff and their sleep is good and they have the diet nailed in and they're taking care of their stress in a healthy way, how does intermittent fasting change if somebody's been doing that when they were having a menstrual cycle? As things begin to change with the body, how should they change the fasting?
Well, I think that you have to be attuned to the communication that your body is trying to give you. So I actually think women in menopause have it easier because they don't have as much hormonal fluctuation. I think perimenopause is its own kind of bastion, if you will, that it's very much its own unique properties. And I find for a lot of women, when they're not eating with the same meal frequency, like they're not eating every 2 or 3 hours, their blood sugar is better balanced. If their blood sugar is better balanced, guess what? They don't have hot flashes. They're not waking up with night sweats. Like drenching night sweats for a lot of people is like miserable. I mean, I'm grateful that I never really experienced that. But I think when I hear women describe to me how much better or how their hot flashes have gone away entirely in response to eating less frequently and restructuring their macros, that is the gift that I think for perimenopause for a lot of women is that they start losing weight even though they've been stuck. They start balancing their blood sugar better, which means they're not having so much blood sugar dysregulation. They're not getting as much hot flashes. They're not having as many night sweats. And in many ways, I've seen many women who feel as if their menstrual cycles are not nearly as heavy as they were before because they're balancing, oftentimes when you've got excess estrogen around, when you are releasing weight, you will also get rid of some additional estrogen stores. So adipose tissue, for anyone that's not familiar with it, is actually a very sophisticated organ. It is really an organ. It's got inflammatory cytokines and other, components that really can be highly inflammatory. And so if women are storing a lot of estrogen mimicking chemicals or other types of toxins in this estrogen tissue, as they're getting rid of it, for many people, they will lose weight. They'll feel a whole lot better. And I think that is an important focus that we don't talk about enough. The other piece is, as you get better balance between appetite, satiety cues, and appetite and satiety hormones like leptin and ghrelin, you're going to be more satiated. You're not going to feel like you're continuing to look for food, even though you've just eaten a meal, which can be a sign of leptin resistance, which oftentimes goes and coincides with insulin resistance or even that propensity for being insulin resistant. And for anyone that's listening, trying to kind of determine what these hormones are doing, leptin is really critically important for shutting our appetite off. So if you're leptin resistant, insulin resistant, you may eat a meal that anyone else could eat and they'd feel very full, and your brain may not get the communication that you're full. And so that's an important distinction as well.
So let's move into full-on menopause. Somebody gets to the stage in life when, they're not having their period anymore. What age you kind of talked about it before because you talked about how long perimenopause goes, but what age can somebody expect to, get to that point? And then how, again, from an intermittent fasting piece, how can they pivot the way they've been doing that?
Yeah. So the average age in the United States is 51, but I see a lot of thin women going in earlier, 47, 48. Some of my heavier patients go through later because they just have more circulating adipose tissue, which tends to be an estrogen rich tissue. The beautiful thing about menopause, which is 12 months without a menstrual cycle, is that you can provided you're sleeping and you're dialing in on stress and you're eating a good diet and you're not doing the cardio queen on the elliptical every day. You're actually lifting weights and walking. I think it's a beautiful time because you don't have as much hormonal fluctuation. So you have the ability to fast. If you want to fast every day of the month, you can do that. You don't have to take into account that you've got a drop in estrogen and a drop in progesterone right before menstruation. And you're trying to navigate your hormonal fluctuation day to day, week to week, because things are much more stable. I would never suggest that men and menopausal women are similar, but as it pertains to fasting, I think it's much easier for men and menopausal women to fast because they aren't dealing with the fertility piece. They're not dealing with a menstrual cycle. They're not dealing with all the hormonal flux that you experience from when you start menstruating to when you stop menstruating. And so I think that's a really important distinction. Again, I always go back to what's your sleep like? What's your energy? Really checking in with yourself. I have women that will message me all the time and say, I was sick, whether it was with, the pandemic or some other illness. can I still fast? And I always say, what's your energy like? Lean into what your body's telling you. I think the most important thing for us is to be hydrated. But if you're sick and you're not feeling well, you can absolutely fast. However, if you feel like, you have no energy and you're miserable, then, maybe have some bone broth, have something that's going to be nourishing, but is light on your stomach. And so really encouraging women to lean into their intuition and the cues that their bodies are telling them. This is very different than what I used to tell patients when I was a new nurse or new nurse practitioner. It was very like every patient gets this, versus now it's really very individualized, encouraging women and men for that matter to lean into what their body is suggesting or telling them and feeling comfortable and confident with that information.
When it comes to stress management, I'd like to get into some of the nuances, some of the details, some of the things you'd recommend to people to help manage that if they feel like that's an area that they don't have nailed down. So maybe they're not ready to dive into the intermittent fasting full on at this point.
Yeah. So it's important to talk about why stress management is so important. So we have the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and we want to do things that get us out of this fight or flight because our body can't differentiate getting PO'd at our partner or our boss or getting stuck in traffic from running away from danger. It does not differentiate. And so most of us really have to work at getting out of this sympathetic dominant kind of mindset. And it starts really simply. I always say, think about how you can incorporate things into your lifestyle throughout the day. Like I struggle with meditation, but I will sit for 5 or 10 minutes to do that. But I like connecting with nature. My husband and I walk our dogs in the morning sunlight without sunglasses on. So we kind of start our day there. And so I encourage people to find things that they enjoy, that bring them joy, whether it's listening to music, reading a book, soaking in magnesium. You'll see the common theme is you don't necessarily have to do something grandiose.
Cynthia, for somebody that's been intermittent fasting, but maybe they haven't been getting the results they wanted or expected, or just could get, and we're going to get into some of those benefits throughout our conversation, what do you find are the biggest things that are holding people back from getting the best results when it comes to fasting?
Oh, goodness. There's so many different things I can think of. I would say that it starts with basics. So if they're not sleeping well, and by that I mean high quality, good amount of deep and REM sleep. And, obviously I track everything on an Oura. You don't necessarily need an Oura or Whoop band, but are you waking up refreshed or do you feel like you're dragging in the morning? So understand that sleep is foundational to our health, and how many women in particular start really struggling with sleep issues north of 40 years old. So if you're not getting high quality sleep, irrespective of gender, that's number one. I would say number two is a lot of people still think they can eat like they're 18 years old. And I hate to be like a bummer, but I'm here to tell you that what we eat is equally as important as when we eat. And so if someone is being diligent about high quality protein, healthy fats, the right types of carbohydrates, they're oftentimes going to have much better success than someone that's still eating hyper palatable, highly processed foods. Because even if you're eating within a compressed feeding window, if you're eating inflammatory foods, and this could be very unique for each one of us. People may think they're eating a healthy diet, but they're still consuming a lot of dairy, a great deal of like gluten and grains. Maybe they're consuming too much alcohol. And I think coming off the past 3 years, that has certainly been the case when I start talking to patients about their alcohol consumption. So I think macros do matter. And I think the choices that we're making, obviously, if you're more insulin sensitive, you can get away with a bit more discretionary carbohydrate than someone who is not. And we know that only 7% of Americans right now are metabolically healthy. And so really understanding when I'm talking to different types of patients, someone that's struggling with weight loss resistance and is obese and overweight is probably going to have to be very cognizant of their carbohydrate intake versus a very athletic, lean individual who is insulin sensitive. The other things that are common for me to see along with that alcohol piece are just adverse childhood events. So understanding the complex interrelationship between trauma, and trauma really is a scar for people to understand that trauma doesn't have to be big T trauma. I trained at a big research institution, and I thought if you haven't experienced going through a significant trauma, like you've been raped, you experienced profound neglect, you were involved in, a loved one having gone through a suicide or something very significant, then you didn't experience trauma. Well, there's little t trauma that can be equally as impactful. And so if you really look at the research, individuals that have a high adverse childhood event score are more at risk for not only autoimmune conditions, but also weight loss resistance. And that can be from many different factors. And then I would say the other more common thing that I will see with some regularity is dirty fasting. And so people don't like me to talk about this, but I'm going to, because I think it's so important to understand that if you are weight loss resistant, what you eat in your fasting time frame is important. So there are bars out there that are marketed to people as being a fasting bar. And I always say that's an oxymoron because you're not meant to eat in a fast. Or people are having copious amounts of fatty coffees. So whether it's butter, ghee, heavy cream, there are calories in these healthy fats, right? And so understanding that if you are weight loss resistant and you're trying to lose weight and you're having a 300 calorie fatty coffee every morning and you're trying to figure out like, okay, I only eat in this very narrow feeding window, but I'm also having this very fatty coffee, which is why I'm not hungry, which is why I'm not having 2 meals in my feeding window. And so I think that can oftentimes be problematic. And there are influencers out there who tell patients that if it's under 50 calories, it doesn't matter. And so again, I go back to understanding what is a clean fast. And I think a clean fast is the type of fast that you want to engage with, or engage in rather, when you are weight loss resistant, so that you are getting rid of extraneous things that could potentially be contributing to why you are struggling to lose weight. So I think those are probably the most common things that I see. The other little piece that I would probably tie in there is chronic stress. Again, coming off this 3 years of, post-pandemic, out of the pandemic, hopefully never have to see a pandemic again in our lifetime. Chronic unrelenting stress, reminding people that acute stress isn't a bad thing, but chronic unrelenting stress. You're going through a divorce, you lost your job, you just have a stressful situation. I can tell when my cortisol's up because I get jittery. Well, guess what happens when our cortisol goes up? Guess what also goes up? Your blood sugar correspondingly, because your body is actively engaged thinking there's some type of a predatory threat. And then your insulin goes up. So understanding that chronic stress can be a huge contributor, and really encouraging people to find ways to decompress their lifestyle as much as possible. I think that we don't talk enough about this, and we expect people to just figure it out. And I think in our over-harried, overstressed, sympathetic dominant existences, helping people understand that chronic unrelenting stress can be at the basis for why you are not getting the body composition changes that you're looking for, really struggling with that scale being stuck. All these things can occur at the same time, but that's another major contributor that I think a lot of individuals aren't thinking about, because they just go about their lives thinking everyone has stress. Stress isn't a big deal. And I remind people, like, if your stress is impacting your sleep, which is impacting your food choices, it's this, big circle. It's like the circle of, discomfort. It's like all these different things are kind of creating the perfect environment for your body to just hold on to the calories or hang on to the fat that you're trying to get rid of, and not understanding that oftentimes it's choices that we're making day to day that can impact that in pretty significant ways.
For people that, who just took all that in and are feeling overwhelmed on where to begin, say they're holding on to extra weight and they just feel like, okay, this is great. I want to begin. I want to start, but I want to start small with the biggest levers that are going to make the biggest impact. How would you recommend that person get started? And then over time, assess what you just talked about and look at some of the more nuanced pieces, just so they can get that inertia moving for them and start to lose weight and start to get their energy back and feel better.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that we start small, because it is overwhelming to make a lot of changes all at once. So sleep is foundational. That is the first thing we work on. If people come to me and they want to start fasting and they're in groups, I'm like, nope, got to sleep first. So the most important thing you can do is get high quality sleep. And yes, that is going to involve making some lifestyle changes. It may be that you need to be in bed 30 to 60 minutes earlier than you have been. And so it's as structured as, thinking about us as parents. You have a daughter, I have a couple teenagers. When they were babies and toddlers, there were things that we did in their lives that told them or gave their body cues that it's time to gear down and go to bed. And so I teach adults to kind of think the same way strategically about their own sleep habits. So when you get up in the morning, I want you to start thinking about sleep for that evening. So that means getting light exposure in the morning, getting outside. I don't care if you sit on your front steps and you just drink your cup of coffee or your tea, or you just sit there with your child or your pet, but get some light exposure on your retinas first thing in the morning, because that will help suppress melatonin and increase cortisol. Tells your body it's time to get up and get moving. And then also at the end of your day, if you're able to, we've had daylight savings and it's a little lighter out, a little later, maybe you're watching the sunset, or maybe you're getting outside at dusk. It's kind of reminding your body that we're kind of making this transitional from being light outside to being dark outside, understanding that you want to sleep in a cold, dark room. Now, in my house, we sleep at 65 degrees. Everyone sleeps really well, really, really well. And that has been our normal for probably the past 10 years. I also sleep with a sleep mask. Now, being a guy, that might not be something that you're interested in, but we make sure like our landscaping lights are out by 11 o'clock. That helps out. We have shutters on our windows, so everything is closed. Being in the dark is very important. Understand you might need to add rituals. So sometimes using magnesium spray. I love to talk about magnesium, but we know magnesium, most of us are depleted in magnesium at pretty significant and profound levels, especially if we're dealing with this chronic stress. Even organically grown fruits and vegetables are grown in soils that are magnesium depleted. So if you assume because you're eating all organic that you're not having to deal with this, I assure you that you probably need more magnesium. Maybe it's magnesium spray or magnesium oil. I like both transdermal or skin absorbed magnesium as well as oral magnesium. I think about other things that are helpful, like in terms of supplementation, like myo-inositol is very helpful. Thinking about soaking in magnesium if you're not using a spray, thinking about oral magnesium, thinking about getting off electronics. I know that may not be something that everyone can do every single night. I get it. That's why blue blockers are so effective. I mean, I wear them. My kids laugh at me. They used to wear them, but now they're teens and I know nothing. So now we're at the stage where I'm the one wearing it in front of the TV, and then I can go to bed after I watch a movie. Wearing blue blockers, which is going to help with not suppressing melatonin and telling your body it's time to party. The other thing that I think is really helpful for sleep is understanding the interrelationship between chronobiology. So the way that our body, we have clocks throughout our bodies. I think most people think about the pineal gland, which is in the brain, but we have melatonin clocks or circadian clocks throughout our body and diffusely in the digestive system. So if you eat a large meal within 2 to 3 hours of bedtime, you have the potential, again, I'm going to emphasize potential because I have teenagers who seem impervious to eating an hour before bed and still fall asleep, but they're also, younger people. But understand the interrelationship between meal timing and its impact on sleep. So if you are eating 2 hours before bed, getting reflux, not sleeping well, tossing and turning, if you've got your heart rate variabilities all over the place, it could be that you have offset this seesaw effect between melatonin and cortisol. So if you eat that bolus of food, melatonin gets suppressed because your body's trying to actually process all this food that you've consumed. So I do think that there's value in closing your feeding window or having your last meal earlier in the evening or later in the afternoon, depending on the individual. And those are typically the things I find are of greatest benefit to help with sleep support. Obviously, there are things that go beyond that, but those are easier things that most people can tangibly do that don't involve a lot of gadgets. I mean, I love gadgets, but I acknowledge not everyone else does. I think this is like a heyday to, being in the hospital. I like to measure things, but not everyone else does. So I think those things are a really good foundational principle to looking at sleep that I think most people could slowly, one at a time, do those things. The other thing that I think is important with sleep that I didn't mention is physical activity. So we are designed to move. We are not designed to be sedentary all day long. And so sometimes I'll have patients that will say, I have a sedentary job. And I'm like, then every hour, get up and walk stairs or walk around the circumference of your office or do something to break up the monotony of sitting all day long. So physical activity, obviously, I'm going to say strength training is going to be important, but just walking can be very, very helpful for ensuring that our bodies have exerted enough energy during the day that they need that restful, restorative sleep. And the last thing that I would say about sleep that I think is important is alcohol consumption. So we know that alcohol can be very disruptive to deep and REM sleep. For a lot of individuals, it allows them to fall asleep, but then they wake up. And I think that for anyone who's ever struggled with sleep, once you figured out what works for you, you really don't want to deviate because you acknowledge how much better you feel when you've had a good night of sleep. So understanding that alcohol consumption, although yes, it might be able to help you fall asleep, can disrupt sleep architecture enough that it can impact not only how you feel in the morning, but it can also impact your blood sugar, impacts leptin and ghrelin, which are these appetite and satiety hormones, and can impact your choices the next day. So when we don't sleep well, we don't crave broccoli and chicken, we're going to crave junk. And so just understanding that those kind of pieces can all work together, but maybe one at a time. Maybe you see if, okay, this reinforces good sleep, I want to do more of that. And understanding you don't necessarily have to do every one, but I think that those components can really contribute to sleep quality in profoundly impactful ways.
A lot of great stuff there. And I'll add a couple little caveats to that. One being when you talked about not eating right before bed, another piece of that ties into our eating window is the fact that we're less insulin sensitive at night. So if we're going to get into eating windows and get into the nuances of intermittent fasting throughout our conversation, but moving that eating window, another reason beyond what you talked about is the fact we're more insulin sensitive and we're going to process that food better if we have it earlier in the day.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I've been to events where I've been around other health and wellness professionals, and there's always a unicorn, right? I met Ben Greenfield about a year and a half ago, and he was talking about how he has a large bolus of carbohydrates at night. Ben is a wonderful unicorn individual who's incredibly lean. He's also, I think, still in his 30s. But I think most of us, to your point, we are more insulin sensitive during the day. And that is, again, aligned with that circadian clocks in the body. And so I think that that's a really good point to help people understand that the average person does better certainly eating carbohydrates earlier in the day, but also understanding that insulin sensitivity piece is going to be important, especially as individuals are getting older and they are very likely losing some of their insulin sensitivity.
What I really like about this piece of the conversation around sleep is the fact that we're talking about a lot of variables beyond the things that happen in bed or right before bed. You know, you talked about getting the daylight first thing in the morning. I think that's just so important for our sleep later on at night. And now we're talking about when we're having food. And these are all different inputs. You mentioned exercise too. So it's looking at getting the right inputs at the right time throughout the day to sleep better at night.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of individuals, they just, until they start having trouble with sleep, they don't even think about sleep. I certainly was one of those people until I got into my early 40s. As soon as my head hit the pillow, I woke up in the morning, magically, I felt rested. And then all of a sudden that wasn't the case anymore. And so I started thinking very thoughtfully, what are the things I'm doing that are negatively impacting my sleep that I can change? You know, getting older is not one of them. So, trying to think thoughtfully about what can I do? And then obviously, if you're doing all of those things and you're still having trouble sleeping, then we have to look a little bit deeper. But most individuals will benefit enormously just with making those changes that we kind of starting the conversation, because as you appropriately stated, it's overwhelming when some wellness professional out there gives you 50 things you should be doing. You're like, okay, I can just work with one at a time, and that's okay. I think it's very important to meet our patients and our clients where they are, as opposed to, using this, I used to call it ivory tower, in medicine. That's the ivory tower answer. Well, that's great, but that's not realistic. So let's be realistic so that we can all ensure that everyone's getting better quality sleep.
And you mentioned Ben Greenfield there being a unicorn. The other thing that brought up for me is the fact that when it comes to caffeine, we all metabolize it differently. And that's one of the common things you'll hear when people talk about sleep, making sure your caffeine is within a window earlier in the day, which makes a lot of sense. But you also have the individual variability depending on how you metabolize that caffeine. Some people can push it a little later into the day, but I want people to be mindful if they are having trouble sleeping at night. That is an area you want to look to early on because it's obvious to a lot of people, but some people might be missing it.
And what I found about the research surrounding caffeine is that if you're a slow metabolizer, it could take you 12 hours. Yes, 12 hours to metabolize the caffeine you consumed in the morning. I have a child who was a competitive swimmer until this past year, and he would have 2 or 3 espressos. I'm not kidding. He could have that in the evening because he loves the taste of espresso, and he could go to bed. And I was amazed. I was like shocked, but I realized when we did genetic testing, both he and I are fast metabolizers of caffeine. I don't drink caffeinated things after 2 o'clock because I'm just too concerned that I might negatively impact my health. But what's interesting is there's definitely a genetics piece that plays into that. So if you think if you're sensitive or you're a slow metabolizer, you definitely want to be cognizant of when you consume that last cup of coffee or tea or any other caffeinated beverage, Red Bulls and other things that I tell my children that they shouldn't be drinking.
I'm glad we went deep into that sleep piece, and probably not the obvious direction people would assume when we're going to have a conversation primarily about fasting, but it's critically important. And what I want to talk about now is why. We know how to sleep well, but let's talk now about the piece of why sleeping well is so important, specifically when it comes to somebody that's going to embrace fasting.
I think that when we understand that intermittent fasting is a form of hormesis, so beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time, it's understanding that in order to gain all the benefits from fasting, you have to ensure that you're getting to a position with your lifestyle that your body is not overstressed, because you're already adding a little bit more stress with the fasting piece. And so when we're approaching fasting, when I'm having conversations, it's trying to determine, is someone optimized in order to have success with this? Because what sometimes happens is that someone becomes weight loss resistant and they start getting into this mindset that if fasting is good, more is better. If restricting my calories is good, restricting more is better. If exercise is good, more is better. And so they get into trouble where their body is just so stressed, physically and otherwise, that they're not going to garner the benefits from an intermittent fasting lifestyle because they just haven't convinced their body that they're safe enough, that they're in this advantageous position, that they're going to be able to have success and also be able to effectively repair. Like, one of the things people forget about when we're talking about fasting is a lot of times that you're fasting, you're sleeping, right? So if you're in this position where your cortisol's up and you're not properly recovered from your workout and you're not getting enough sleep, that's going to negatively impact some of these physiologic benefits that go on with fasting that we don't see per se from the outside. And it impacts the way that our brains detoxify and break down plaques and, tau proteins and other things that our body is effectively getting rid of with sleep. So I do think that if you want to have success with intermittent fasting, one of the first boxes that must be checked is making sure that you're getting good quality restorative sleep so that your body is ready to kind of accept a little bit more hormesis. Hormesis are things, or hormetic stressors are things that allow us to become stronger and more resilient. But we don't want to pour gasoline on a fire. That's usually the analogy I give, is that your body thinks that you have just poured gasoline on a fire. So we've got to quiet everything down and then reintroduce this when we've already worked through all this inflammation and other things that are going on with you personally.
And Cynthia, what would you say is the best barometer for somebody who has, say, even been listening to the show and taking on all these different forms of hormetic stress, whether it be the sauna, cold plunging, fasting, exercise? There's so many different forms, and they can all layer on, and people over time can start to accumulate all these into their healthy routine. And in the right amount, at the right time, of course, if the person isn't overwhelmed with stress, they're good for the body. But how do people know whether they're pushing it too hard? Is it just waking up and feeling refreshed in the morning? whether the weight's coming off, if that's part of their goal right now with their health journey? How do they assess that?
It's such a good question. And you're right. If more is better, then more is better, right? I think a lot of it is, and this isn't per se tangible, but this kind of flow state where, you don't have to force anything. You don't have to force the cold exposure. You don't have to force the fasting. You don't feel like you have to force anything. It just is something that you're attuned to. I know that for me as an individual, I don't love cold weather. I don't like being cold. So I would say I probably need the 15-second tail end of my shower to be cold, because that's going to challenge my body and I can walk away and not feel like my whole morning has been ruined. But I would never be one of those people that wants to be in a cold plunge pool. And that doesn't per se mean there's anything wrong with me. I just think for me, I don't need as much hormetic cold exposure to be able to garner the benefits, because it's something that I genuinely don't enjoy, like not even a little bit. And I'll just be fully transparent. I think for each one of us, we have to look at, what is your schedule like? Are you doing these things and you have plenty of time to do these things, like the cold exposure, the infrared sauna, the doing high intensity interval training, lifting weights, intermittent fasting? If you feel like you're able to fit it into your lifestyle and you don't feel encumbered, you don't feel like you're stressed, I think that it's helpful to do a little bit of hormesis every day, as opposed to spending like hours trying to get all these things done. I do have clients that will try to fit everything in, and it's stressing them out so much that I'm like, all right, wait, time out. This is not probably the strategy we want to be forcing ourselves to do. Like, I don't believe white knuckling anything. You don't white knuckle fasting. You don't white knuckle the exercise. You don't white knuckle the heat exposure or the cold exposure, because that's valuable bits of information your body's trying to tell you. And so I think that there's a healthy amount of optimization, and then I think it becomes obsessive. And I definitely, within the past year, have met individuals where I've had to say, I think this is gone from being a healthy endeavor to now this is, you can't, like, your life has gotten so programmed that you're not able to effectively change course or make corrections or have a social life, because you have to get these 5 things in before you're willing to even start your day. I think it's so individual is really the answer I'm trying to provide. So bioindividuality rules. I know for myself, I think that not liking cold there's probably some genetic susceptibility to that. And I've read research to suggest that, but I'm not going to force myself to do it. If I don't feel like doing it, I'm not going to do it. But I do have individuals where I'll say, well, why don't we just have one thing every day that you do, like as a starting point? Maybe you fast every other day. Maybe you do infrared sauna twice a week. Maybe the other day you do cryotherapy or you do a cold shower. And then maybe on that 7th day, you do a little bit of high intensity interval training or strength training or whatever fits into your schedule, and see what you like. Because unfortunately, whether it's an influencer or someone in the health and wellness space, a lot of our listeners desperately want to mimic what they see us doing. And that's why I think it's so important. And what's responsible to say is what works for your budget, what works for your lifestyle and your sanity. Because to suggest to everyone listening that you have to do these 8 metrics every day is woefully unrealistic. I can't even do that every day. I can tell you the things I crave, the things that I know my body, like I like to exercise. So that's a part of my lifestyle every day, but I don't per se force myself to do it. If I wake up and I don't feel good, then I back off on it. But I think it's important to kind of have that internal dialogue to see what feels and resonates with you, and to understand that if you're trying to mimic what someone else is doing, there's no shame in that, but just understand that bioindividuality absolutely plays a part in all of this. And so finding what works best for you, I think, is very important.
And I think a layer that adds some challenge to all this is the fact that social media, you mentioned influencers, people can post pictures of, doing cryotherapy or jumping in the sauna, and that just represents one little part of the day. And that might be the part that they choose to highlight. And then their followers are going to see that, and then maybe they'll look at another person they're following and seeing them doing something else. And then people can get so overwhelmed thinking they're not doing enough and that they need to take on all these different modalities. And really, you're going to get the biggest bang from your buck oftentimes by getting the foundation right. Things like sleep and intermittent fasting and having a solid diet and hydrating. And it always comes back to the basics. And I think for a lot of people, seeing that can be an injustice because it sends them off in the wrong direction. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think a lot of people, as an example, want to see what I'm eating. Well, I try when I'm sitting down and having a meal, I try not to have my phone next to me. And so sometimes I'll post like, this is what I broke my fast with. And then I forget to take a photo of what I ate later. And then people are in my DMs and my team are like, people really love to see what you eat. And then we get questions, well, how did you grill that? Or what's the recipe? Or what's this, what's that? And so I think that we have a responsibility to kind of just be transparent and say, this is a snapshot of one thing that I did in my day. And it's not meant to do anything other than just show you transparently what I'm doing. This may not work for you. Like, I really like protein. I really like non-starchy vegetables. I don't feel deprived eating those things, but there are plenty of people who are like, I hate doing that. I don't want to eat more protein. I don't want to eat the non-starchy vegetables. I would do better having a higher fat diet. I'm like, that's great. That's not me. And so I think that we have to be responsible citizens and kind of disclose what works. People always, as an example, they want to see what I'm doing in the gym. And I struggle with this because I'm an introvert. And when I get to the gym, the last thing I want to do is take a photo of myself or a video while I'm doing something, because that's just not me, but people want to see it. And I said to my husband, we now live in a different city, and the gym that I go to is it's like a bro gym, and there's nothing wrong with that. But, to be like posing and it's not me, it's not authentic. And so I think that we owe it to ourselves to share what we feel comfortable with, but also have some healthy boundaries and just say, I'm not going to show everything. I try to be as transparent as possible, but I think realistically, there are very susceptible individuals on social media that see what we're doing, and then they want to replicate that for themselves. And I would say the power of the N of one is a beautiful thing. But if you do what I do and you don't feel good doing it, well, that's valuable information, right? Don't force yourself to do it. Maybe you don't feel good with fasting. Maybe you need less sleep. Maybe you're a magical unicorn and you need less sleep. And there is a small subsect of the population that needs like less than 6 hours a night of sleep, but that's a really small subsect of the population. Most people aren't that way. And so I think part of the responsibility of, existing in this space is just telling people like trial and error. That's what I tell people all the time. Try it out, see what works. It's so different than when I was in clinical medicine, and it was like almost everyone if you had coronary artery disease, you got these 5 things. Or if you had high blood pressure, this is the algorithm of medications we would do. And I started to just understand that there's so much that's innately different about each one of us that we can't have a one size fits all. And I think the same thing applies to lifestyle.
And the other layer too, when it comes to influencers, is a lot of times what people don't know or might not know is these products are sent to us for free to test and to show. And this, for people like me and you, this is our work and our life all twisted into one. So, it's part of our job to test different things and to experiment so we know, so we can share with the audience and we can learn for ourselves and then share what we're learning. So for somebody who is working a 9-to-5 job, and then they would expect themselves to, come home and make dinner for the family and to keep up with some of the things that we're doing because this is what we do, that's very unrealistic. And I think it's too much pressure on people.
It really is. It's funny. My mom is retired, but she was here for a couple days this week. And when she comes to visit, I always like to share with her the things I've enjoyed receiving most recently. And sometimes I'll send her home with some samples. And I'm like, if you like this, I will get it for you, because she's retired and she is now on a budget. She's never been on a budget. So now she's on this budget and she's just amazed. I mean, she's in a different, different age group. She worked for a big healthcare organization. I mean, she just never had these kinds of things that show up magically at her front door. And she marvels at it. I'll say to her, we were trying to take pictures. I have a new podcast sponsor. And so I was taking pictures. We were making recipes with the ingredients. And my mom was lovingly trying to help me create these shots. And I was like, no, I know exactly what I need. I have to put the product and the recipe and this and that. I've said it to my team. And she was just fascinated. She was like, wow, like you can really be very creative in this space. And I said, yes, you have the ability to have a lot of creativity, which is a blessing and a curse. But you're right, to your point, that a lot of what we do in our day to day may not be realistic for someone that's working a totally different kind of job. Like my husband works, he works for a large consulting company, and he just happens to work from home. So our lifestyle kind of beautifully kind of interplays. But if we were still working out, if I were still seeing patients in the hospital and he was still working, 30 minutes away from home, we wouldn't be able to do some of the things that we do. We just wouldn't have that much flexibility. So I think that's a really good point to just acknowledge that, each one of us have different jobs and different roles. And there are things about our kind of podcasting duties that allow us to have a bit more flexibility in some areas than others do.
For somebody that's stuck with us to this point and, they're on the fence saying, intermittent fasting, it sounds great. It's not something I've tried. What are some of the other health benefits we haven't talked about that we can share to help people that are on the fence right now?
I always say I'm a big fan of people being on less medication. So if you are diabetic, if you have high blood pressure, we know that insulin resistance drives both of those disease states. So with intermittent fasting, you may get to a point where you can be off those medications. If you're struggling with PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome, even male factor infertility can be directly correlated with insulin resistance. So I remind people that in a lot of instances, it has kind of bigger picture applications. So less medication, less diagnoses, less insulin resistance. The neurocognitive benefits, women are protected from a lot of neurodegenerative diseases until they go through menopause, largely a byproduct of estradiol signaling in the brain. So I'd like to remind people, I don't know about you all, but I want to be sharp as a tack for the rest of my life. So the neurocognitive benefits, especially with insulin signaling in the brain, we know that type 3 diabetes, we think of as Alzheimer's. And so I remind people that it's not just impacting women, it's also impacting men. So brain health, cognitive function is super important. I think about some of the associations with certain types of reproductive cancers, a reduction in certain types of reproductive cancers, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, et cetera, just by eating less frequently, ovarian and endometrial cancer. And so I think it's just important overall, not just, reductionistic thinking that it's just one thing that drives the benefits. It's really from head to toe. It's really thinking brain health, heart health, muscle health. I always say muscle is the organ of longevity. Thank you to Dr. Gabrielle Lyon for teaching me that. But I think it's very, very helpful for people to have more tangible, less medication, less diagnoses, less likely to develop certain types of cancers, more likely to have a healthier brain, longitudinally throughout your lifetime. And that's huge beyond just the autophagy and changes in body composition and reduction in inflammation and oxidative stress and healthier mitochondria. There's so many benefits. And I find a lot of people come to intermittent fasting out of a curiosity and wanting to change body composition, but ultimately they'll stay because they feel so good in their skin.
Well, I agree. I think body composition is what's going to bring the most people into this. And then hopefully they're going to realize being into it over a period of time, all these other benefits. But since that is the thing that's going to bring a lot of people in, can you talk a little bit about the physiology of why when somebody starts compressing that eating window, it's going to help them lose weight?
Yeah.
Other than the fact that it's less calories generally, but not always. Somebody might, in that, say it's a 6 or 8 hour window, they might make up for the time that they weren't eating and eat just as many calories in that period. So I just love for you to talk about the physiology.
I think on a lot of different levels that when we think about the changes in body composition, it has a lot to do with the fact that we've got this better balance between blood sugar and insulin. And so insulin gets this really bad rap. Everyone thinks it's really negative. But I remind people that when our insulin levels are lower, we can go in and free up fatty acids and use them as fuel. So I always say that you don't want to be eating all the fats. You want to have your body utilize all the fats to keep you fueled. So one of the ways that you will oftentimes change body composition is that your body becomes much more fuel efficient. It's going to go in and use fats as a primary fuel source. So it's going to be much more efficient. And the one way to think about it is when insulin levels are high, you shut off fat burning in the body. And so if you're eating and eating and eating throughout the day, you're never allowing your body. It's like topping off a fuel tank. Like my dad used to always do this. We'd have 3/4 of a tank of gas and he'd always top it off. And so it's the same kind of methodology that you never allow your body to empty the tank. And so you're never going to get to those fat stores for energy. I think Jason Fung always does a really beautiful explanation for how you have to burn through everything in the refrigerator before you can get to the freezer. And so it's the same kind of methodology that if you keep eating throughout the day, it's going to make it less likely for your body to become efficient. The other thing is all these counter-regulatory mechanisms. So a lot of times people say, oh, it's just about the calories. No, it's not. It's actually that there's this neurohormonal beautiful symphony of neurotransmitters and hormones that go on behind the scenes when you're not eating that allow you to upregulate fatty acid oxidation, that allow your body to actually become much more fuel efficient, if you will. The other thing is I'm encouraging women to be strength training throughout their, whether they're training fasted or unfasted is not the concern. But as we build and maintain more muscle mass, we are going to have bigger glucose reservoirs. We're going to be able to be more insulin sensitive. And so if you take intermittent fasting and combine that with weight training, it can be profoundly impactful. Sorry, it's the dogs distracting me. Like I had this great train of thought. Sorry, there's two of them. It's like children, I'm like, they bark at the UPS guy every day. But I think it's important for women to understand, men as well, that if you are intermittent fasting, you're secreting more growth hormone, especially at night. That's why the sleep piece is so critically important. But you can build and maintain more muscle mass. More muscle mass you have, the more insulin sensitive you will become. More insulin sensitive, you'll become more metabolically flexible you will become. And so it's a twofold issue when it comes to fasting and being able to change body composition. It's, that better hormonal regulation and signaling, being more insulin sensitive is going to allow you to maintain and build more muscle. Sorry.
For somebody who does get that eating window down to say 6 or 8 hours, they, break their fast at noon, maybe have their dinner at 6 or 8 p.m. If they're not snacking in between, are they getting into fat burning mode, or is it just during the overnight fast?
I think about the overnight fast in particular. I mean, I think the greatest concern when someone has a compressed, like a 6 or a 4-hour eating window is, are they getting enough macros in? And some people can. They can get 2 very large boluses of food with plenty of protein. Always the concern is, are they getting enough food in? Because I do see, not just in women, but also in men, sometimes as they whittle that amount of time in which they eat, if they keep doing OMAD as 1 meal a day, there's no way someone's getting in 100 grams of protein in 1 meal. Maybe a man is, but women would really struggle. So I think from my perspective, it's all the benefits that go on when we're in an unfed state that are going to really upregulate those processes. But obviously, if you have 3 to 4 hours between a meal, you're allowing your blood sugar to improve. You become more insulin sensitive in between meals, but it's really the time that you're in an unfed state that you're getting the most benefits.
So snacking isn't ideal, but if we are in our eating window and say somebody gets into a position where they are hungry, they're going to break the fast. Well, not a fast. I guess it becomes a fast again, a shorter fast in between meals. What I'm getting at is snacking. Are there better snacks than others if somebody has to eat in between meals?
I would say that when we look at what has the greatest insulin response, I would say it's, carbohydrates, then protein, then fat. So if you wanted to have some avocado, if you wanted to have some MCT oil, if you're getting hungry, obviously I just kind of identified that MCT oil has some very unique properties. I always say if you're hungry enough to eat, then you're hungry enough to have a piece of protein. That's usually where I lean personally, just because I tend to be very animal protein focused. But I wouldn't go have a handful of grapes and a big banana. I would probably lean towards a piece of beef jerky, or maybe you're going to have some avocado with some salt on it. That's going to be better. You're going to have less. You're going to mitigate less of an insulin response with those kinds of foods versus carbohydrates.
And before we wrap up here, Cynthia, let's zoom out in a really general sense, comparing men to women. Any other differences we need to address when it comes to intermittent fasting between men and women?
Yeah, I mean, I think women have more adipose tissue, so it sometimes takes longer. And if you look at the studies, if you're doing like both men and women, looking at a research study, men may lose weight faster because they have more muscle mass than women, but over an 8-week period of time, they will lose the same amount of weight. So I think with women, we have to be patient, that it's not instantaneous. In fact, I get DMs all the time. Like, I've been doing fasting for 3 weeks and I haven't lost a pound. I'm like, okay, well, you have to give it more time. So I think there are gender differences, not just about the fluctuating hormones with a woman in her cycling years, but also the distribution of adipose tissue and, muscle tissue. We are going to be at a little bit of a disadvantage in terms of time, but it is possible. It's what I always say, be patient. So I think that women need to learn to be patient with results and understanding that a lot of the benefits of intermittent fasting are going on behind the scenes, meaning it's the non-scale victories that are really critically important. In fact, I kind of am an advocate of staying off the scale unless you're just doing it a couple times a month. But I have women that like live and die by those numbers. And I think that's so incredibly destructive, detrimental to their mental health as well as their physical health.
Now that you're done with Cynthia, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Mindy. She's got a lot more to share about fasting. You don't want to miss this. I'll see you over there.
So if you want to lose weight, I really feel like the first thing we've got to look at is when you eat, not what you eat. Coffee may really help one person.